There is a road in the Philippines that does not appear on any tourist map. It runs north, through a peninsula of jungle and dust, through towns whose names most of the world has long since forgotten. It is an ordinary road in an ordinary country, and if you drove it today, you would pass school children and market stalls, and the ordinary noise of life going forward. But if you knew what to look for, if you stopped and stood very still in the April heat and let the silence settle around you, you might feel something, a weight in the air, a gravity that does not quite belong to the present. More than 80 years ago, on that same road, somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 men walked north in the sun. They were starving. They had already been fighting for months on a fraction of the food a soldier needs to survive. Their uniforms were rags. Their boots were falling apart or gone entirely. Many of them were sick with malaria, with dysentery, with the particular exhaustion that sets into a body that has been pushed past every reasonable limit and then pushed further still. They walked because the alternative was to die where they stood. Some of them died anyway. Hundreds of them, possibly thousands. The exact number is still debated, still contested, still one of the many open wounds this story left behind. This is the story of the Bataan Death March, and it begins long before that road. It begins in Washington, in the quiet offices where men drew lines on maps and made assumptions about how wars would be fought and how long soldiers could hold an island before help arrived. It begins in Tokyo, where a different set of men made a different set of calculations about the Pacific, about oil, about empire, about who would ultimately control the world's largest ocean. It begins in the Philippines, where American and Filipino soldiers trained, or tried to train, with equipment that was old or inadequate, or simply absent, in units that looked strong on paper and were heartbreakingly fragile in reality. It begins, in a sense, on the morning of the 8th of December, 1941, when the phone lines started buzzing with word of what had happened overnight at Pearl Harbor, and the commanders in the Philippines realized, with a particular cold clarity, that the war they had been preparing for, the war they believed they had time to prepare for, had already started. Without them, without their consent, without the runway they needed. What followed over the next 4 months is one of the most painful chapters in American military history. A defense mounted against impossible odds by men who deserved better than the hand they were dealt. A siege that lasted far longer than anyone had a right to expect, sustained by sheer stubbornness and the dark comedy of soldiers who wrote sardonic poems about their own abandonment. A surrender, the largest surrender of American-led forces in history, made by a general who had no good options and chose the least terrible one available to him. And then, when the fighting was finally over, the suffering that followed was in many ways worse than the fighting itself. The march, 65 miles, roughly speaking, through the April heat of the Luzon plain. No food provided, water withheld, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through a chaos of logistics that amounted to the same result. Guards who were, some of them, disciplined and professional, and others who were cruel in ways that still resist easy explanation. Men who fell and were left. Men who fell and were not. Acts of extraordinary compassion from Filipino civilians who lined the road and passed food through the columns at real risk to themselves. Acts of extraordinary brutality that still appear in the nightmares of the men who survived them and lived long enough to speak. And then the camps. Camp O'Donnell, which was not ready to receive thousands of broken men, and received them anyway. Cabanatuan, where prisoners organized themselves into something resembling a civilization, ran schools, staged theatrical performances, built a covert radio network from scavenged parts, and died in numbers that the record keepers struggled to keep up with. Years of captivity, years of silence, because the story was suppressed, first by Japan, which did not want the world to know what had happened on that road, and then, for a time, by the United States government itself, which had its own reasons for timing the revelation carefully. When the truth finally came out, when 3 escaped officers brought their testimony to Washington, and the government released it to the American press in January of 1944, the response was a kind of national fury. The country had known the Philippines had fallen. It had not known, not fully, what falling had meant for the men who were there. The stories that emerged from that press release changed something in the American understanding of the Pacific War. They changed what the war was about, who it was being fought against, and what kind of reckoning was owed. This documentary tells that entire story, all of it, from the geopolitical miscalculations of the 1930s, through the desperate weeks of invasion and retreat, through the siege and the surrender, and the march, and the camps, through the liberation and the war crimes trials, and the long, complicated, often insufficient aftermath. 18 chapters, the full arc, as completely as it can be told. We have made this for the long-form listener, for the person who wants to understand something properly, not in the quick-cut, 3-minute version, but in the full weight of its detail and its human texture. If you are watching this for the first time, find a comfortable position, let your breathing slow, and allow the story to come to you at its own pace. If you find yourself drifting towards sleep, that is exactly where we want you. These stories have a way of working on us, even when our conscious minds let go. The history stays. If this is the kind of storytelling you come back to, if this is the channel you reach for when you want something serious and carefully made and worth your time, then take a moment now, before we go further, and subscribe. It is a small thing that makes a genuine difference. Every person who subscribes means we can keep making documentaries like this one, at this length, at this level of care. We are grateful for every one of you who has found us. Now, the Pacific, in the late 1930s, a vast blue expanse of competing ambitions and strategic anxieties, of naval treaties quietly straining at their limits, of a small island nation that had been watching the great powers of the West carve up Asia for a century, and had decided, with a ferocious and disciplined intent, that it was their turn. And on the western edge of that ocean, on a long green archipelago of 7,000 islands, a garrison of American soldiers and their Filipino allies stood watch. They had a plan. They had commanders. They had, on paper, a force that looked like it might hold. They had, in reality, far less than they knew. This is where it begins. In the years before the world caught fire, the Pacific Ocean was not a battlefield. It was a vast blue silence, stretching across nearly a third of the Earth's surface, a space so enormous that the human mind struggled to hold its dimensions. Empires faced each other across it, not yet with guns, but with trade agreements and naval treaties, with diplomatic cables and carefully worded ultimatums. The United States sat on one shore of that silence, a nation of vast industrial wealth and uncertain ambition, still carrying the bruises of the Great War, and in no hurry to find another. On the far shore sat Japan, a nation moving with the urgent, purposeful speed of a country that believed its moment in history was arriving. Between them lay thousands of islands, dozens of sea lanes, and one archipelago that both powers understood, in their quieter moments of strategic honesty, was sitting directly in the path of whatever was coming. That archipelago was the Philippines, And in the late 1930s, it was where America chose to plant its flag and make its stand, not with adequate men or adequate supplies, but with remarkable confidence and a plan drawn up decades earlier for a war that no one fully believed would actually come. The American presence in the Philippines was not a recent arrangement. The islands had passed from Spanish to American hands at the close of the 19th century, following a war that lasted only a few months, but inaugurated a colonial relationship that would last for nearly half a century. Manila, the capital, had become a city of contradictions, a place where American administrators drank gin on wide verandas, while a Filipino independence movement simmered steadily beneath the surface. By 1935, the Commonwealth of the Philippines had been established, a transitional political structure designed to lead the islands toward full independence within a decade. The Americans were, in theory, preparing to leave, but they had not yet left, and the military installations they maintained, the naval base at Cavite, the sprawling facilities at Fort Stotsenburg, the airfields scattered across Luzon, represented something that could not simply be folded up and taken home. They represented commitment, whether Washington fully intended that commitment or not. Presence, in the language of geopolitics, has a way of becoming obligation. The island of Luzon sat at the northern end of the Philippine archipelago, and its importance was not difficult to understand if you laid a map on a table and looked at it honestly. Manila Bay, on Luzon's western coast, was one of the finest natural harbors in the entire Pacific. Whoever controlled Manila Bay controlled a staging point for operations across a vast arc of ocean stretching from China to the Dutch East Indies. The bay was deep, sheltered, and capable of accommodating the largest warships afloat. At its mouth sat a cluster of fortified islands, the most significant of which was Corregidor, a tadpole-shaped rock bristling with heavy guns that American engineers had spent decades turning into what they hoped was an impregnable fortress. For American naval planners, the ability to use Manila Bay was not a luxury. It was foundational to any serious military engagement in the Western Pacific. Lose it, and you lost your foothold. Lose your foothold, and you were fighting the entire ocean. Tokyo understood this perfectly. Japan's strategic ambitions in the 1930s were not secret, exactly, though they were often discussed in the kind of careful diplomatic language designed to prevent anyone from having to react to them directly. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 had been the first visible crack in the post-war order. The full-scale war against China that began in 1937 was something far larger, a conflict that consumed hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops and required enormous quantities of oil, steel, and raw materials to sustain. Japan possessed almost none of these resources in its home islands. It needed them. The European colonial empires in Southeast Asia, Dutch, British, French, sat on vast reserves of exactly what Japan required. And between Japan and those resources stood the American presence in the Philippines, a sword pointed directly at the sea lanes Japan needed to survive. It was a geographic fact that neither side could pretend away. Washington's relationship with Tokyo through the 1930s was a slow, grinding deterioration, dressed up in the language of negotiation. American officials protested the invasion of China, imposed incremental economic restrictions, and watched as Japan's military government responded to each measure with escalating defiance. The Export Control Act of 1940 placed restrictions on certain materials flowing to Japan. A later embargo on oil, the resource Japan needed above all others, turned a cold relationship into something approaching a countdown. American intelligence analysts and senior naval officers understood that Japan's military planners could not accept an indefinite embargo without either capitulating to American demands or acting decisively to seize the resources they needed by force. The question was not whether the breaking point was coming. The question was how fast it would arrive, and whether the United States would be ready when it did. The answer to the second question was about to become painfully clear. The American military plan for a potential Pacific War had existed in various forms for decades. It was called War Plan Orange, and it was a document that reflected both the considerable strategic intelligence of the officers who wrote it and the considerable institutional optimism that allowed them to believe its assumptions. The core of War Plan Orange was straightforward. If war with Japan came, the Philippines could not be held indefinitely against a determined Japanese assault. The garrison on Luzon was to fight a delaying action, fall back to the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor, and hold out for approximately 6 months while the American Pacific Fleet steamed west from Hawaii to relieve them. The plan was built around the Navy's ability to force its way through Japanese naval forces and resupply the beleaguered garrison before it collapsed. It was, on paper, a coherent military strategy. It was also dependent on a chain of assumptions, each of which needed to hold for the plan to function. Almost none of them would. The first and most important assumption was that the Pacific Fleet would be intact and capable of mounting a relief operation. The second was that the garrison in the Philippines would be strong enough and well supplied enough to hold its defensive position for the required duration. The third was that air power could protect the fleet during its westward advance across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. Each of these assumptions would be violently demolished within the first hours of the war. But in the years leading up to that moment, War Plan Orange gave American commanders in the Philippines something psychologically valuable, even if militarily precarious: a framework, a reason to believe that resistance was not futile, a structure around which to organize their preparations, however inadequate those preparations ultimately proved to be. In July of 1941, a decision was made in Washington that changed the calculus of the Philippine defense in ways that were simultaneously encouraging and deeply dangerous. General Douglas MacArthur, who had retired from the United States Army to serve as military advisor to the Philippine Commonwealth, was recalled to active duty and given command of the newly created United States Army forces in the Far East. His appointment was accompanied by something remarkable, a genuine shift in American strategic thinking that suggested the Philippines might actually be held. New long-range bombers, the Boeing B-17, were being sent to the islands in significant numbers. Military planners in Washington began speaking with new confidence about using air power to deter or punish a Japanese attack. MacArthur himself believed it. He told Washington that with sufficient reinforcements arriving by April of 1942, the Philippines could be made defensible. The timeline he offered was not unreasonable. If every promised reinforcement actually arrived on schedule, and if Japan obligingly waited. Japan was not going to wait. The reinforcements MacArthur received were real, but they were not enough, and more critically, they were not in time. Aircraft arrived in modest numbers. Supplies were shipped from the United States and accumulated in warehouses around Luzon. The Philippine Army, which existed largely on paper, began calling up its reserve divisions, men who in many cases had received only weeks of training, who carried rifles that were decades old, and who in some units had never fired a live round. The gap between the force that existed in official reports and the force that could actually fight was staggering, but it was a gap that optimism and institutional momentum had a remarkable ability to conceal. Commanders looked at their order of battle charts and saw divisions. What the charts could not show was that those divisions were shells, formations with names and numbers, but without the sinew of trained soldiers. adequate weapons, or reliable supply lines. Beneath all of this ran a current of assumption about Japan itself, an assumption that would prove catastrophically wrong, but was entirely consistent with the racial and cultural attitudes of the era. American military planners generally did not believe Japan was capable of executing a simultaneous, multi-theater offensive against both Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, with the speed and coordination that such an operation would require. The Japanese military was often dismissed as technically proficient, but strategically cautious, capable of fighting a regional war in China, but unlikely to challenge the United States and Britain simultaneously across thousands of kilometers of ocean. This was not merely arrogance. It was arrogance built on ignorance, a failure to credit the enemy with the ambition, the capability, and the meticulous operational planning that Japanese commanders had in fact been developing for years. The men who would land on Luzon had been studying its beaches, its roads, its airfields, and its defenders, with a thoroughness that no one in Manila or Washington had fully appreciated. And so the Pacific waited, in that late 1930s calm that only seems calm in retrospect. American officers played tennis at the Army-Navy Club in Manila. Patrols went out on routine schedules. The B-17s sat gleaming on the airfields of Clark. Plans were made, orders were written, and in Washington, cables were exchanged with Tokyo in language that grew steadily harder and less hopeful with each passing month. The men who would eventually walk the roads of Bataan were still at home in Ohio and Texas and the farming towns of the Philippines, living ordinary lives in the last ordinary year they would ever know. The plan was in place. The garrison was in position. The assumptions were all still intact. And the clock, though no one yet knew precisely when it would strike, was running. It was always running. On paper, the defense of the Philippines looked formidable. General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the islands in July of 1941, summoned back from retirement by Washington to take command of United States Army forces in the Far East. A command title grand enough to suggest genuine military power. MacArthur brought with him a reputation built over decades, a distinguished record from the First World War, and an intimate knowledge of the Philippine archipelago that few American officers could match. He had served here before, spending years in the islands as a military advisor, and he carried with him a deep personal conviction that the Philippines could be defended, that the archipelago was not simply a tripwire to be sacrificed, but a fortress to be held. Washington, increasingly anxious about Japanese ambitions in the Pacific, was willing to believe him. Reinforcements were promised. Resources were pledged. On paper, the numbers were growing in the right direction. The theoretical force under MacArthur's command was, by the standards of a colonial garrison, genuinely substantial. There were roughly 31,000 American and Filipino regulars, the core of any serious defense, supplemented by the Philippine Scouts, an elite constabulary force with a fighting tradition stretching back decades, widely regarded as some of the finest soldiers in the Pacific theater. The Scouts were professional, disciplined, and well-equipped relative to what was coming, and they would earn a reputation on Bataan that no amount of subsequent tragedy could diminish. Alongside them stood roughly 100,000 men of the newly organized Philippine Army, paper formations that existed in organizational charts and planning documents as coherent, battle-ready divisions. On those charts, the archipelago's defense appeared robust. Off those charts, the reality was something else entirely. The Philippine Army had been in existence for barely 5 years when MacArthur was called to organize its expansion, and the accelerated mobilization of 1941 compressed what should have been years of training into weeks. Men were called up who had never fired a rifle, issued uniforms that didn't fit, and handed weapons that were often older than the men carrying them. The standard infantry rifle in many Philippine Army units was the Enfield pattern from the First World War era, serviceable in theory, problematic when the men behind it had fired fewer than 10 rounds in training. Artillery batteries existed on paper and sometimes in practice, but shell stocks were dangerously thin, and the fire control techniques that turn a gun into a weapon of precision rather than noise required training that simply had not happened. In unit after unit across Luzon, the pattern was the same. The organizational skeleton was present. The flesh and muscle of genuine combat readiness was not. The logistical picture matched the training picture with grim consistency. Ammunition reserves for the Philippine garrison fell well short of the minimums that American war planners had calculated necessary for sustained operations. Medical supplies were insufficient, and the medical infrastructure of the Philippine Army, field hospitals, surgical units, evacuation chains, existed largely in concept rather than in material fact. Food stockpiles on Luzon were dispersed and inadequately protected, a problem whose consequences would prove catastrophic when the fighting began, and the routes that connected supply depots to fighting men became contested ground. Washington had authorized the flow of reinforcements and materiel, but the pipeline moved slowly, and the calendar moved faster. When the blow finally came in December of 1941, the build-up was still very much in progress. Into this landscape of organized optimism and hidden fragility walked the key commanders who would carry the weight of what was coming. General Jonathan Wainwright commanded the North Luzon Force, the largest single command on the island, responsible for the most likely invasion corridor down from Lingayen Gulf. Wainwright was a cavalry officer in the older tradition, lean and angular, a man whose personal courage was beyond question, and whose instinct was always to be forward, to be visible, to share whatever hardship his men were enduring. His soldiers would come to regard him with genuine affection, the kind of loyalty that is only earned by a commander who is never far from the sound of the guns. But courage and presence, however admirable, could not compensate for the thinness of his force and the scale of what would be asked of it. Wainwright knew the numbers. He drove his jeep along the northern defensive lines, and he knew. General Edward King commanded the Philippine Department Artillery, and later would take command on Bataan itself, a quiet, methodical officer whose steady temperament and technical competence in logistics and artillery made him something of a contrast to the more theatrical figures of the Philippine Command. King was not a man who sought headlines or cultivated mythology around himself. He was a planner, a detail man, someone who understood the relationship between shells fired and shells available, between men fed and men capable of fighting. That analytical clarity, which should have been an asset in the months of preparation, would eventually position him as the man left holding the consequence of every decision that had been made before the first shot was fired. History would require something extraordinary of Edward King, and it would come at the worst possible moment. Above both of them, commanding the entire theater from his headquarters on Corregidor, and later from Manila, was MacArthur himself. His relationship with reality in the early months of his command was complicated by the enormity of what he was trying to accomplish. MacArthur was not a stupid man, nor was he unaware of the deficiencies in his force. His training reports to Washington were often candid about shortfalls, his requests for reinforcement genuine and repeated. But he was also a man of pronounced self-belief, and that self-belief sometimes bent his assessment of his own army toward what he needed it to be, rather than what it demonstrably was. He told Washington his forces could hold the beaches. He told his Filipino counterparts that relief would come. Whether he fully believed these things himself, or whether he understood them as necessary fictions to sustain morale during the build-up, is a question historians have debated for generations without resolution. The Filipino scouts deserve a chapter of their own in any honest accounting of this period. These were professional soldiers in every sense, organized into regiments with long histories, officered by both Americans and Filipinos, trained to a standard that the hastily mobilized Philippine Army divisions could only aspire to. They had served in campaigns across the archipelago. They knew the terrain of Luzon in ways that newly arrived American reinforcements did not, and they possessed the institutional culture of a unit that had learned its trade over time, rather than in a compressed and inadequate crash course. When the battles came, the scouts would fight with a tenacity that repeatedly surprised Japanese commanders who had been briefed to expect rapid collapse. Their performance would be one of the few genuinely affirming stories in an otherwise bleak military narrative. The American regulars in the garrison were a mixed force of veteran non-commissioned officers, long-service soldiers who had cycled through the Philippines on rotation, and more recently arrived men who had expected a relatively comfortable overseas posting and instead found themselves on the edge of a war. The Philippines had long been regarded as a plum assignment in the peacetime army. Warm weather and a relaxed pace, and the particular social culture of a colonial garrison. The men who had been there for years knew the islands, the climate, and often the people with genuine warmth. But a comfortable posting and a combat-ready garrison are not the same thing, and the gap between them would matter enormously when the time came to fight a first-rate military force pressing south with momentum, air superiority, and an operational clarity of purpose that the garrison could not match. What made the situation particularly difficult was that so many of the problems were visible to the people responsible for solving them. The training reports filed by American officers attached to Philippine Army divisions were often alarmed in their assessments. Men observed conscripts who could not march 10 miles, artillery crews who had never registered their guns on a target, headquarters staffs who had no experience coordinating movement and fire across even modest distances. These reports went up the chain. Some produced corrective action, some produced reassuring responses, and some simply settled into the bureaucratic sediment of a headquarters managing too many competing demands. The system was trying to build an army, at the same time it was preparing to fight with one. A contradiction that even the most capable commanders in the world would have struggled to resolve in the time available. The geography of Luzon imposed its own logic on the defense. The island's northern plain, dominated by the central Luzon lowlands, and funneled toward Manila from Lingayen Gulf, was the natural invasion route. Everyone knew it. Both sides had wargamed it, and the Japanese would use it exactly as predicted. Wainwright's North Luzon force was positioned to contest this approach, but the force available to him was thin relative to the frontage it had to cover, and the Philippine Army units filling the gaps in his line were the least prepared of all. Further south, General George Parker's South Luzon force held a quieter sector, but would face its own trial when the Japanese landed additional forces to apply pressure from multiple directions. MacArthur's command was stretched, and the distances across Luzon that gave the defense its theoretical depth also made rapid concentration of reserves extremely difficult. As 1941 moved through its final months, there was a sense among the men in the Philippine garrison of a gathering pressure they could feel but not yet name. Training continued, supplies slowly accumulated, the organizational machinery of a modern military establishment ground forward. Some officers were quietly confident, persuaded by MacArthur's assurances and Washington's promises that the arc of preparation was bending toward readiness. Others were less certain, troubled by what they saw in their own units, unsettled by the intelligence picture of Japanese military power building across the Western Pacific. The scouts drilled, and the Philippine Army conscripts marched, and the American regulars maintained their equipment and wrote letters home, and all of them lived inside the last ordinary weeks of a world that was about to end. The fortress was not yet a fortress. The men who would have to hold it did not know that yet, but some of them suspected. On the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, the world that American commanders in the Pacific had been carefully managing, the world of diplomatic tension, cautious positioning, and cautious optimism, ended in the space of roughly 2 hours. Across the international dateline in Hawaii, Japanese carrier aircraft swept down on Pearl Harbor in 2 devastating waves, sinking or damaging the core of the United States Pacific Fleet at its moorings. The news traveled by radio, by telephone, by sheer screaming urgency across the Pacific in the hours that followed. In the Philippines, it arrived while most men were still eating breakfast. General Douglas MacArthur received word in Manila sometime before 4 in the morning, local time, the 8th of December. He had roughly 9 hours before Japanese aircraft would appear over his airfields. 9 hours that should have been enough. 9 hours that, through a combination of confusion, paralysis, and command failure, were squandered almost entirely. The Far East Air Forces, under General Louis Brereton, represented the single most powerful card in the Philippine garrison's hand. By the autumn of 1941, a substantial force of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers had been flown out to the islands as part of a deliberate American strategy to create a credible air deterrent in the Western Pacific. The thinking was seductive in its logic. Heavy bombers based at Clark Field on Luzon could, in theory, threaten Japanese shipping lanes, strike at invasion fleets, and make any assault on the Philippines an extraordinarily costly proposition. For months, Washington had spoken about these aircraft with something close to reverence. They were the equalizer. They were the reason the Philippines might actually be defensible. What the calculations had not fully accounted for was what would happen if those bombers never got off the ground. Brereton understood the danger the moment he heard about Pearl Harbor. He moved quickly, requesting authorization to launch a preemptive strike against Japanese airfields on Formosa, the island roughly 900 kilometers to the north, from which any air assault on the Philippines would almost certainly originate. His request went up the chain of command and ran into the stone wall of MacArthur's headquarters. Exactly who said what in those critical hours has been disputed for decades, with Brereton and MacArthur's staff offering versions of events that contradict each other in almost every particular. What is not disputed is the outcome. The authorization to strike Formosa did not come. The B-17s were kept on the ground, and then, when the order to send reconnaissance aircraft north finally did arrive, it came so late that the bombers had to be landed, refueled, and rearmed, which meant they were sitting on Clark Field, fully loaded and nearly wing to wing, when the Japanese arrived. There was a warning, that much is certain. Radar operators at Iba Field, on the western coast of Luzon, picked up a large formation of incoming aircraft well before noon. The information was passed up the chain. Fighter pilots at Clark Field were scrambled, circled, burned through their fuel waiting for direction, and were then called down to refuel at roughly the worst possible moment. When the Japanese formation, a mix of high-altitude bombers and Zero fighters, crossed the Philippine coastline, the American response was scattered and uncoordinated. Some pilots were still on the ground, others were in the landing pattern. A handful got into the air and fought with extraordinary courage against impossible odds. But the fundamental preconditions for catastrophe were already fully in place before the first Japanese bomb fell. Clark Field was struck just before noon, local time, on the 8th of December, 1941. The Japanese came in at high altitude first, their bombs walking in tight patterns across the runway and the aircraft parking areas. The anti-aircraft guns at Clark were firing, but the attacking formation was too high and too organized for the response to be effective. Then the Zero fighters came down low and worked methodically along the flight line. B-17s burned where they sat. P-40s burned. Fuel dumps burned. The hangars and repair facilities that would be needed to sustain any air campaign burned. Men who had been refueling aircraft minutes before were throwing themselves into drainage ditches and foxholes, watching their entire air force cease to exist in a single afternoon. Eber Field to the west was hit at almost exactly the same time. There, the fighter squadron based on the field had actually scrambled and gone up to intercept the incoming Japanese formation, detected by radar, but the timing and communications had broken down sufficiently that many of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawks were descending to land when the attack began. Some were caught in the landing pattern. Others made it to the ground only to find the field already under attack. Eber's radar installation, one of the few functioning early warning assets available to the Philippine garrison, was destroyed. With it went the ability to see what was coming from the north with any advance notice. A comparable proportion of the fighter strength was gone. The crews who survived were experienced men, and they would continue to fight with whatever remained. Flying reconnaissance, flying cover, flying night patrols in aircraft that were increasingly grounded by a lack of spare parts and fuel. But the idea of the Philippines as a fortress anchored by strategic air power had died on a runway on the 8th of December. It had died not because the Japanese were invincible, but because the aircraft that were supposed to stop them had been caught precisely where aircraft should never be caught: stationary, unprotected, and waiting. The human cost of those hours extended far beyond the men killed in the attacks themselves. Every American and Filipino soldier who would fight on Bataan over the following 4 months owed part of his eventual fate to what happened at Clark and Eber. The absence of air cover would mean that Japanese shipping could move freely in Philippine waters. It would mean that resupply convoys, even if Washington had chosen to send them, would face uncontested Japanese air and naval power. It would mean that the men on the ground would fight without any umbrella above them, exposed to Japanese bombing runs and strafing attacks throughout the long months of the siege to come. The loss of the aircraft was not merely a tactical setback. It was the removal of the one condition under which the defense of the Philippines had ever been theoretically plausible. In the aftermath of the strikes, the search for explanations began almost immediately and has never entirely stopped. Some historians have placed primary responsibility on Brereton for failing to push harder for authorization to strike Formosa when he had the window. Others have pointed to MacArthur's headquarters for the delays in decision-making that consumed those critical morning hours. Others still have raised questions about the structural problems of a command system in which authority was layered and responsibility was diffuse. A system that responded to the greatest crisis in its existence with hours of hesitation. The specific truth of who knew what and when has been obscured by conflicting accounts, wartime politics, and the natural human tendency to reconstruct memory in more flattering terms. What survived the post-war analysis was not a clean verdict, but a portrait of institutional failure under pressure. The men who lived through those first hours carried the memory for the rest of their lives. Pilots who had scrambled and found nothing but chaos above Clark Field, mechanics who had been working on engines minutes before the world turned into fire and noise, radio men who had tried to pass warnings through telephone systems that jammed or went silent. All of them would spend decades asking the same question. Why were the aircraft still on the ground? It was a question that had no satisfying answer, only a set of decisions and failures that stacked on top of each other in the hours after Pearl Harbor until the opportunity had closed. The window for striking Formosa, for dispersing the aircraft, for getting anything meaningful into the air, had been roughly 9 hours wide. It closed when the first Japanese bomb hit Clark Field. What remained after the smoke was a garrison that was, in one fundamental sense, already beaten before the land fighting had properly started. The soldiers who would stand on Bataan, who would eat half rations and then quarter rations, who would fight malaria and dysentery alongside Japanese artillery, those men were being condemned to their ordeal, in part by decisions made and unmade on the morning of the 8th of December. The aircraft that were supposed to give the Philippines a fighting chance were wreckage on a runway. The strategic equalizer had been equalized, and across the South China Sea, Japanese transports were already being loaded with the troops who would come ashore at Lingayen Gulf before the month was out, confident now that the skies above their landing craft would be empty of serious opposition. There is a particular cruelty in the timing of it. The men at Clark and Iber had heard about Pearl Harbor. They had spent hours expecting the blow to fall. They had, in many cases, taken some steps toward readiness, scrambled fighters, alerted gun crews, sent aircraft aloft in anticipation of attack. And then, through the grinding friction of a command system that could not move fast enough, through miscommunication and indecision compounded by genuine uncertainty about where authority began and ended, the readiness had dissipated. The aircraft had come back down, the crews had dispersed to refuel, and the Japanese formation had appeared on the horizon at almost exactly the moment when the garrison was most exposed. Fate, in the Philippines on the 8th of December, wore the face of institutional failure, and it arrived, as catastrophe so often does, not with a sudden shock, but with the slow, awful recognition that the chance to prevent it had already passed. The sea off Lingayen Gulf was calm in the early hours of the 22nd of December, 1941. Beneath a sky still dark enough to conceal the shapes of ships, the Japanese invasion fleet moved into position. It was enormous, more than 80 transport vessels, escorted by warships, carrying the bulk of General Masaharu Homma's 14th Army. Roughly 43,000 troops were packed into those transports, trained, equipped, and fully supplied for the campaign ahead. On shore, Filipino lookouts had already sent word of lights on the water, of engines in the darkness, of something vast approaching from the north. The reports climbed the chain of command with agonizing slowness. By the time the first Japanese landing craft scraped onto the beaches of Luzon's northern coast, the defense was already behind. Homma was a complicated man by any standard of the Imperial Japanese Army. He had lived in England, attended military exchanges in the West, and was known within Japanese officer circles as something of a literary figure, a man who wrote poetry and harbored private doubts that sat uneasily alongside the war machine he served. His orders, however, were blunt. He was to seize Luzon, capture Manila, and do it within 50 days. That timetable had been handed down from Imperial General Headquarters with the kind of confidence that came from underestimating what resistance might look like once cornered. Homma knew better, or suspected he should, but orders were orders, and his army was now pouring ashore at Lingayen with methodical, practiced efficiency. The Filipino and American units tasked with defending the Lingayen coast were not the forces that existed on paper. They were the forces that actually existed, which meant something far less capable. The Philippine Army divisions holding the northern beaches had been mobilizing for barely 5 months. Many soldiers carried rifles that misfired, or had never fired them at all. Artillery support was scattered and poorly coordinated. Communication lines were fragile. The training that Washington had imagined would have these men combat-ready by the spring of 1942 had not happened because there had not been enough time, enough instructors, enough ammunition to practice with, or enough of almost anything else. When the first Japanese regiments waded ashore under covering fire and pushed inland, the Filipino defensive lines did not bend. They broke. Within hours of the Lingayen landings, the situation was unraveling faster than any single headquarters could track. Filipino army units that had trained for months in the expectation of holding beach positions found themselves outflanked, outgunned, or simply swept aside by the disciplined momentum of Homa's veterans. Entire companies dissolved into the surrounding farmland and jungle. Officers tried to rally men who had no framework of experience for what was happening to them. Men for whom the sound of sustained artillery fire was entirely new, for whom the sight of coordinated amphibious assault was something no exercise had ever approximated. The collapse was not a failure of courage, in any simple sense. It was a failure of preparation, and the men dying and scattering on those beaches had never been given what they needed to succeed. MacArthur received the reports at his headquarters in Manila. The numbers coming in were already alarming, and this was only one landing. A second Japanese force had come ashore at Lamon Bay, on Luzon's southeastern coast, 2 days later, threatening to squeeze the island from both ends simultaneously. The strategic logic of War Plan Orange, the plan that called for the defenders to hold the central Luzon plain, prevent an enemy advance on Manila, and wait for a relief fleet from Hawaii, was collapsing under the weight of reality. The relief fleet was not coming, at least not in any time frame that could save the Philippines now. The Pacific Fleet had been gutted at Pearl Harbor. The assumption that had given War Plan Orange its coherence had been destroyed on the 7th of December, 15 days before the first Japanese soldier touched the beach at Lingayen. For MacArthur, the decision that now faced him was one of the most painful of his career. He had championed the forward defense plan, had assured Washington and Manila that the Philippine army would be ready, had staked considerable professional reputation on his belief that the beaches could be held. To abandon that plan now, to order a retreat before Manila had even been seriously threatened, was to admit that the entire strategic posture had been built on sand. But the alternative was worse. To try to hold the central Luzon plain with disintegrating units, no air cover, no naval support, and an enemy advancing on 2 axes simultaneously, was not a defense. It was an execution. MacArthur made his choice. On the 23rd of December, he issued the orders to revert to War Plan Orange, a modified version of the contingency plan that called for a fighting withdrawal into the Bataan Peninsula, the rocky, jungle-covered thumb of land that jutted south into Manila Bay. Bataan had always existed in American war planning as a fallback, a place where a besieged force might hold out for 6 months while awaiting relief. The peninsula was defensible by nature, its terrain channeled by mountains and jungle into narrow corridors that would negate much of Japan's numerical advantage. Corregidor, the fortified island at the tip of Manila Bay, would anchor the seaward flank. In theory, an organized, well-supplied garrison on Bataan could hold for a very long time. The theory was sound. What followed the order to retreat was not. The withdrawal down the central Luzon plain that began in the final days of December 1941 was chaos, given a military name. More than 80,000 soldiers, American regulars, Filipino scouts, and Philippine Army conscripts had to disengage from advancing Japanese forces, move south along roads already clogged with refugees, coordinate with units they had never trained alongside, and do all of it faster than any withdrawal of that scale should reasonably happen. Filipino civilians by the tens of thousands had joined the columns, pushing carts, carrying children, driving livestock. The roads were packed from ditch to ditch. Japanese aircraft, now flying without meaningful opposition, swept the routes. When a bomb landed in a crowd of soldiers and civilians, those around the impact point scattered into the fields, and then someone had to gather them back, push them forward, keep the column moving, because stopping was death of a different kind. The rearguard units that held the Japanese advance long enough for the main body to withdraw deserve a measure of recognition that history has not always given them. Small groups of Philippine scouts and American regulars fought delaying actions across rivers, road junctions, and narrow bridges, buying hours at enormous cost so that the greater mass of men and material could continue moving south. The most critical moment came at the Calumpit bridges over the Pampanga River. If the Japanese reached and crossed those bridges before the retreating columns could use and then destroy them, the entire withdrawal would be cut off. The bridges held just long enough. The last units crossed and the charges were blown, and the columns lurched southward, with the sound of the explosion still settling across the plain behind them. Yet even as men were congratulating themselves for reaching Bataan alive, another disaster was taking shape, one that would haunt every day of the siege to come. The food and supply stockpiles that should have been pre-positioned on Bataan, the reserves that War Plan Orange had always assumed would be waiting, were not there. Not all of them. Some had been moved during the period when MacArthur had still believed in the forward defense, dispersed to locations across Luzon rather than concentrated on the peninsula. Others were in warehouses in Manila, which was declared an open city on the 26th of December to spare it from destruction, meaning its supplies were effectively abandoned rather than fought over. Millions of cans of food, thousands of tons of rice and other provisions, sat in depots in and around Manila as the last defenders streamed past them southward. Some units looted what they could carry on their backs. Most could not carry enough. The mathematics of the coming siege were already poisoned before the first Japanese shell landed on Bataan's ridgelines. Manila itself fell on the 2nd of January, 1942, with Japanese troops entering the capital to find it largely empty of military resistance, its streets quieter than a city of that size, and history deserved. MacArthur had already moved his headquarters to Corregidor. Wainwright was commanding the North Luzon force, fighting rearguard actions with diminishing resources and increasingly exhausted men. The last units crossed into Bataan, and the perimeter was sealed. Behind them, the roads to the north were open. Ahead of them was a peninsula of jungle and mountain and disease, and somewhere beyond that jungle, the ocean, and beyond the ocean, America, which was fighting for its survival and could spare nothing for the Philippines. Not yet, perhaps not for a very long time. There was a moment, perhaps, in those first days on Bataan, when the men who had made it across still allowed themselves the thought that endurance might be enough, that if they could hold the line, hold the ridges, hold the roads through the mountains long enough, something would change. Relief would come. The math would somehow work out. The exhaustion and the hunger and the mosquitoes and the heat would pass, and the fleet would appear on the horizon, and the war would turn. That moment did not last long, but it existed. And for men who had just survived a catastrophic 2-week retreat through a country falling apart around them, arriving battered but alive on the Bataan Peninsula, was not yet defeat. It was, for just a little longer, a chance. The road south was not a route of retreat. It was a race against a clock that no one could see, ticking toward a single, irreversible moment when the bridges over the Pampanga River would be blown, and the door to Bataan would either be open or forever shut. Along the length of the central Luzon plain, tens of thousands of soldiers, American regulars, Filipino scouts, and Philippine Army conscripts who had barely finished their basic training, were moving south through dust and heat and the sound of artillery closing behind them. They moved at night where they could, because the daylight belonged to Japanese aircraft that swept low over the roads, looking for columns to strafe. They moved through towns where civilians watched from doorways with expressions that mingled gratitude and grief, understanding, perhaps better than the soldiers themselves, what the sight of a retreating army meant for everything that came after. This was not a rout, not yet. It was something more disciplined and more desperate than a rout, and the difference was being bought, hour by hour, by the men assigned to the rearguard. The rearguard actions of December 1941 and the first days of January 1942 are among the most consequential and least celebrated small unit fights in American military history. Along a succession of river lines and road junctions across the central Luzon plain, Filipino and American units turned, held a position for as long as it took, inflicted what damage they could on the advancing Japanese forces under General Homma, and then disengaged and fell back to do it again. The men doing this work were often exhausted before they even took their positions. Many of the Philippine Army units had been in the field since the landings at Lingayen Gulf, falling back from positions they had never been adequately prepared to hold. Their weapons were frequently mismatched, their ammunition calibers incompatible across squads, and their radios unreliable on the best of days and silent on the worst. What they had, and what the rearguard effort demanded above all else, was the willingness to stand still while everything else moved backward. General Jonathan Wainwright was the commander most intimately associated with this phase of the fighting, his North Luzon force bearing the brunt of the delaying action as it fell back southward. Wainwright was a cavalryman by background, lean and weathered, and constitutionally incapable of the kind of theatrical confidence that MacArthur projected from his headquarters. What he had instead was a soldier's instinct for ground and a cold understanding of the arithmetic of time. Every hour the rearguard could hold a position was an hour the main body used to move supplies, to move men, to organize the crossing points along the road south. Wainwright rode among his units in those weeks with something approaching contempt for his own safety, because the men he was asking to stand and die needed to see that the cost was being shared, even if it was not being shared equally. His presence alone, at the right roadblock, at the right desperate hour, was a form of combat power. The geography of the central Luzon plain both helped and haunted the retreat. The plain is flat and open, crisscrossed by rivers and irrigation channels that created natural defensive lines, positions a determined force could hold for hours or even a day if positioned correctly. But the same flat terrain that gave defenders a field of fire also gave Japanese aircraft unobstructed visibility for kilometers in every direction, and the roads that funneled the retreating columns southward became killing grounds whenever the planes came. Soldiers learned quickly to scatter into the rice paddies at the sound of engines, lying face down in shallow water until the aircraft banked away, and then rising and reforming and moving again, with the mechanistic exhaustion of men operating on instinct rather than thought. The tropical sun in late December was merciless, and the roads were choked not only with soldiers, but with the overflow of civilian life. Families with ox carts piled with everything they could carry, moving alongside men carrying rifles they had learned to use only weeks before. At the center of everything, logistically and geographically, were the bridges at Calumpit, where the roads from both the north and the east converged before crossing the Pampanga River and continuing south toward Bataan. If those bridges fell to the Japanese, or if they were blown before the retreating forces cleared them, the campaign was effectively over before it reached the peninsula. Thousands of men would be cut off north of the river, and the entire concept of a fighting defense of Bataan would collapse before it began. The pressure on the officers responsible for the bridge crossing sites was therefore immense and unrelenting. They had to hold the approach roads open long enough for the columns to clear, coordinate demolitions that could not happen a moment too early or too late, and do all of this while fighting a rearguard action against an enemy that was pressing hard and growing stronger as Japanese logistical pipelines extended south from the landing beaches. The supply catastrophe unfolding alongside the military withdrawal was, in many ways, the deeper tragedy of those 2 weeks. Across Luzon, there were warehouses and depots holding food, medicine, fuel, and ammunition that the defending forces desperately needed and would spend the next months dying without. The problem was not that the supplies did not exist. It was that they could not be moved. The transportation system was overwhelmed. The trucks were too few, the roads too congested, and the time too short. At some locations, supply officers made the wrenching decision to destroy stockpiles rather than leave them for the Japanese, and so enormous quantities of food and ammunition were burned or blown up in the final hours before positions were abandoned. The full weight of that decision would not be understood until the men on Bataan began to starve in February, counting out spoonfuls of rice and arguing over the edibility of things that no army ration was ever designed to include. The rice warehouses at Cabanatuan were among the most significant losses. Hundreds of thousands of kilograms of rice, enough to have meaningfully extended the siege on Bataan, sat in those warehouses as the retreat swept past, and the combination of transportation failures and command confusion meant that only a fraction of it moved south. Some accounts from the period describe supply officers nearly in tears at the impossibility of what they were being asked to do, trying to improvise truck convoys from requisitioned civilian vehicles, while the sound of Japanese artillery worked its way closer from the north. The institutional failure here was not one of courage, but of foresight. The stockpiling of supplies on Bataan, which War Plan Orange had identified as the essential prerequisite for a prolonged defense, had never been done. The men who would now fight and die on that peninsula would pay the price for decisions made, or not made, in the comfortable months before the war began. Through the first days of January 1942, the columns continued to move. The South Luzon force under General Albert Jones was simultaneously withdrawing northward to converge with Wainwright's force, executing its own series of rearguard actions as it came, and the coordination required to merge 2 retreating forces at a single bridge crossing without catastrophic congestion was a feat of improvisational staff work that deserves far more recognition than it has ever received. The bridges held. The demolitions were timed with enough precision to allow the bulk of both forces to cross before the charges were set. When the spans went down behind the last vehicles, there was no celebration among the men watching. There was only the particular silence of people who understand that a door has just closed, and that whatever comes next, it will be faced without the option of walking back through. The crossing onto the Bataan Peninsula was not a moment of relief. The men who filed across the roads leading into that mountainous thumb of land jutting into Manila Bay did so with the knowledge, spoken or unspoken, that they were entering an enclosure. Bataan is roughly 50 kilometers long and perhaps 30 kilometers wide at its broadest, its interior dominated by 2 extinct volcanic peaks, surrounded by dense jungle that was beautiful and utterly indifferent to the human drama being played out beneath its canopy. The peninsula had roads, but not enough of them. It had water, but the distribution infrastructure was primitive. It had geography that favored defense, steep ridges, dense vegetation, limited avenues for armored advance, and these features would buy time, but time was already running short in ways that most of the men marching in did not yet fully understand. The Japanese naval blockade had tightened around the Philippines in the weeks since the landings, and by the time the defenders sealed themselves onto Bataan, the prospect of a relief convoy arriving from the United States had faded from a hope into a fantasy, into something that men no longer discussed, because discussing it required acknowledging how fully they had been abandoned to their fate. MacArthur's headquarters on Corregidor, the fortified island at the mouth of Manila Bay, continued to transmit optimistic reports northward. Washington continued to express its commitment in language that offered nothing material. The men on Bataan heard these assurances and translated them, in the dark humor that was already becoming the lingua franca of the garrison, into the currency of what they actually were, words that cost nothing and bought nothing and fed no one. And so they dug in, on the ridgelines and in the ravines, and along the roads leading north toward the Japanese lines. The defenders of Bataan began to construct the positions they would hold for the next 3 months. The Filipino scouts prepared their fields of fire with the quiet professionalism that had made them the most respected soldiers in the Philippine force. The American regulars settled into the routines of siege warfare with the pragmatic resignation of men who understood their situation but had decided, for reasons each of them would have described differently, to keep fighting anyway. The Philippine Army conscripts, boys from provinces who had been in uniform for a matter of weeks, watched their veterans and did what they were shown. Above them all, the question that no one asked aloud but everyone carried was the same. How long could this possibly last? And at what cost? And to what end? The answers were forming, slowly, in the hills to the north, where General Homer was reorganizing his forces and preparing to find out how much the Bataan garrison actually had left. By January of 1942, the Bataan Peninsula had become a world unto itself. Roughly 78 miles of tangled jungle, volcanic ridgeline, and malarial lowland, it was now home to somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 soldiers and civilians who had nowhere left to go. The sea blocked escape to the west and south. Manila Bay lay to the east, and the Japanese pressed in from the north, with an army that had swept down the length of Luzon in a matter of weeks. For the men inside that shrinking perimeter, the question was no longer whether the cavalry was coming. The question was how long they could bleed before the end arrived. And yet, against every rational calculation, those men dug in. They built positions in the dark, traded gallows humor in muddy foxholes, and kept the Japanese at bay, week after week, in one of the most ferocious defensive struggles of the entire Pacific War. What they could not defeat was hunger. What they could not hold back was the invisible army of disease, working through their ranks with a patience and thoroughness the Japanese assault had never managed. From the very first days on Bataan, the food situation was a quiet catastrophe waiting to announce itself. The fighting withdrawal down the central Luzon plain had left critical supply stockpiles abandoned or destroyed, and the men who crossed onto the peninsula brought with them only a fraction of the provisions they would need. General MacArthur's headquarters ordered rations cut to half the standard daily allowance almost immediately, a figure that seemed manageable on paper until you measured it against men burning enormous calories fighting in tropical heat and humidity. Half rations for a sedentary man is hunger. Half rations for a soldier moving through jungle terrain and fighting off assault after assault is a slow, systematic dismantling of the human body. Rice became the foundation of almost every meal, supplemented by whatever the peninsula's jungle could yield. Soldiers learned to eat things that no military manual had ever prepared them for. and they did so not out of adventure, but out of desperation. The army on Bataan ate carabao, the great water buffalo that Filipino farmers used to work their fields. They ate horses, including cavalry mounts, that had been brought onto the peninsula precisely because no one had been able to leave them behind. They ate iguanas, monkeys, and pythons pulled from the jungle undergrowth. Filipino soldiers who knew how to identify edible roots and leaves became invaluable, teaching American troops which plants would feed them and which would make things considerably worse. Foraging parties went out not as a supplement to the supply chain, but as a replacement for it. The Quartermaster Corps improvised with a resourcefulness that bordered on the extraordinary, locating a small herd of Visayan dwarf caribou in the interior and working out how to slaughter and distribute them across thousands of hungry mouths. Unit cooks learned to make something resembling a meal out of combinations that no one would have recognized as food a year earlier. Hunger became the dominant fact of daily life, the thing that governed mood and energy and fighting capacity more than any tactical calculation. Rations were cut again before the siege was a month old. Quarter rations were not a military supply status, they were a countdown. A man on quarter rations, fighting malaria and performing hard physical labor, was not holding steady. He was spending his body's reserves in increments, drawing down on muscle and tissue and organ function in ways that would not be immediately visible, but would accumulate into something catastrophic. The men knew it too. There was no collective denial about what was happening to them. The gallows humor that ran through the ranks acknowledged it directly, and with a dark clarity that only soldiers in extreme circumstances can manage. They joked about menus they would order when they got home. Dishes so ordinary they had never thought twice about them before. They joked about what cuts of horse made the best steak. They joked because joking was one of the few things the Japanese could not take from them. Disease was the second front, and in many ways, it was the more merciless one. Malaria had been present in the Philippines for generations, but the conditions on Bataan turned it into a catastrophe of scale. The peninsula's low-lying areas were breeding grounds for the mosquitoes that carried the parasite, and the men living in jungle positions night after night had no practical way to avoid exposure. Quinine, the standard treatment, was in desperately short supply, almost from the beginning. Men who contracted malaria did not get pulled from the line in any reliable way. They shook through fever cycles and then went back to their foxholes because there was no one to replace them. Dengue fever swept through units with its punishing cycle of joint pain and prostration. Dysentery, driven by contaminated water sources and the impossibility of maintaining sanitation standards in jungle combat positions, hollowed men out from the inside. Beriberi and scurvy, the old diseases of deprivation, appeared as the nutritional deficit deepened, the field hospitals filled and then overfilled. Those hospitals were extraordinary places in their own grim way. Doctors and nurses, American and Filipino alike, performed surgery under conditions that would have been considered impossible in any other context. Operating tables were improvised from whatever flat surfaces were available. Anesthesia was rationed with extreme care. Antibiotics were essentially non-existent. The nurses of Bataan, both American military nurses and Filipino nurses who had joined the defense, moved through ward after ward of men who were dying not from bullets, but from fever and starvation, doing what they could with almost nothing. They became figures of profound importance to the men they treated, not merely as medical personnel, but as evidence that something recognizably humane still existed inside the perimeter. The military designation for their jungle hospital sites came to carry a significance far beyond administrative labeling. Those clearings in the trees, with their palm thatch roofs and improvised cots, were where men went to be reminded that they were worth keeping alive. The bond between American and Filipino soldiers was one of the few genuine consolations of life on Bataan, and it grew stronger as the siege extended. The Filipino scouts, the professional Philippine army soldiers who had trained for years alongside their American counterparts, had long since earned the respect of the American regulars. But the broader relationship between the two groups deepened under the pressure of shared suffering in ways that peace had never quite managed to produce. Filipino soldiers taught Americans how to read the jungle, how to navigate without landmarks, how to find water. American soldiers and Filipino soldiers shared foxholes, food, and the particular kind of intimacy that comes from trusting a man with your life in the dark. Language barriers that might have mattered in a garrison dissolved in combat. What they had in common was so much larger than what separated them, that the separations became almost irrelevant. The men also found ways to sustain something like normal life inside the abnormal reality of the siege. Informal schools ran in the rear areas, where soldiers who happened to be educated taught others to read or study mathematics, or explore history. Card games and dice ran constantly in the hours between duties. Baseball games were organized in clearings when the tactical situation permitted, the familiar geometry of the diamond offering something that connected the jungle and the distant world of home. Soldiers wrote letters that they knew might never be delivered, and kept journals in notebooks scavenged from whatever sources presented themselves. Art and music appeared, because human beings under pressure do not abandon the things that define them as human beings. These were not escapes from the reality of Bataan. They were the means by which men held themselves together inside it. But no amount of camaraderie or improvisation could blunt the growing awareness of what was not coming. From the earliest days of the siege, the men had understood at some level that they were operating beyond the reach of practical relief. War Plan Orange had always contemplated a holding action pending a relief force, but the destruction of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor had fundamentally altered the arithmetic of that plan in ways that no one had yet communicated honestly to the men doing the holding. Rumors moved through the ranks constantly, some hopeful and some corrosive, about convoys gathering in Australia, about new fleets being assembled, about political agreements that would prioritize the Philippines. None of them were true, and as weeks turned into months, the gap between the rumors and the observable reality of their situation became impossible to paper over. The sick kept accumulating, the food kept shrinking, the Japanese kept coming. It was somewhere in the sardonic culture of the siege that the poem known as The Battling Bastards of Bataan took shape, passing from man to man in a half-dozen variations until its core sentiment became common property. The exact authorship remained disputed, as such things often do when a piece of writing belongs to a whole community rather than a single voice. What mattered was what it said, which was that the men on Bataan had no mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no nieces, and no pills. A catalogue of abandonment delivered with the flat, affectionate contempt of men who had accepted their situation and refused to be destroyed by it. The poem was funny, and it was bitter, and it was completely honest, and in that combination, it captured something essential about the spirit of the men who lived it. They were not deluded about where they stood. They were not waiting to be rescued. They were choosing to fight anyway, on nothing, for reasons that had moved well beyond strategy or orders, into something more personal and more durable. By March of 1942, the garrison had been fighting for more than 2 months on a logistical foundation that should have collapsed in weeks. The Japanese had not broken through the main line of resistance, despite multiple major offensives. But the army that held those lines was no longer the army that had crossed onto the peninsula in January. It was a diminished thing, ravaged by disease and hunger, running on stubbornness and pride, and the refusal to give an enemy the satisfaction of an easy victory. The Filipino and American soldiers who stood in their positions each morning and prepared to do it again were performing an act that had no rational explanation. They were beyond the point where military logic governed their decisions. What kept them in the line was something harder to name and harder to destroy than any tactical calculation. It was the knowledge that the man beside them was still standing, and as long as he was, so were they. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 11th of March, 1942, General Douglas MacArthur stood on the dock at Corregidor and prepared to abandon the men who had followed him across 2 months of defeat. The island fortress that had become the last American stronghold in the Philippines was collapsing under the weight of Japanese artillery fire. Shells screamed across the narrow waters of Manila Bay, cratering the runway, smashing the fuel depot, killing dozens each day. The men of Bataan could see the smoke rising from across the water. They knew their commander was running out of time. What they did not know was that the order for him to leave had already been signed. President Franklin Roosevelt, thousands of miles away in Washington, had made the choice that MacArthur's life was too valuable to be lost to Japanese captivity or a stray shell. The general would be sent south to Australia. The men on Bataan would be left to whatever came next. The political calculus behind MacArthur's evacuation was brutal and unambiguous. The war in the Pacific had begun so catastrophically that the American High Command could not afford to lose its most celebrated general to captivity or death. MacArthur had built a towering public reputation over decades of military service and carefully managed self-promotion. He was a symbol of American military might, a figure whose face meant something to the American people in a war that had begun with humiliation and defeat. Military leaders understood that symbols mattered in wartime, that public morale was itself a weapon. To allow him to be captured or killed in the Philippines would be to compound an already devastating disaster. Roosevelt was not a man to waste strategic assets. The decision was made not out of mercy toward MacArthur, but out of cold calculation about what the general's continued presence in Australia might accomplish for American strategy in the Pacific. He could rebuild, he could plan, he could return, as the phrase would eventually go, some distant day in the future. The men on Bataan could not. The order came down with stunning directness. MacArthur was to proceed to Mindanao, then onward by plane or ship to Australia. He was to assume command of all Allied operations in the Southwest Pacific Theater and prepare for an eventual offensive. There was no argument to be made, no appeal to be filed. It was a presidential directive wrapped in military language. MacArthur received the order on the 10th of March, and he spent that day in a state of extraordinary tension. He had built his entire career on the principle that a general does not abandon his troops, that he stands with them through victory or defeat, that to leave is to invite accusations of cowardice or desertion. The paradox was complete. Roosevelt was ordering him to violate the code by which generals defined their own honor. Yet the order came from the president himself, and a military officer does not refuse the president. MacArthur resolved the conflict through the only means available to him. He would obey the order, leave the Philippines, and ensure that history remembered him as someone who had been forced to go, who had been taken away against the grain of his own instincts, who would return because he had promised it. The narrative would matter as much as the act itself. As darkness fell on the evening of the 11th of March, MacArthur prepared for departure with a small party that included his wife Jean, their 4-year-old son Arthur, and his senior staff officers. A PT boat, The PT-41 had been sent to Corregidor to extract him. The vessel was small, sleek, built for speed rather than comfort, designed to run through Japanese-controlled waters at night and trust to its engines and the darkness for survival. The crew knew the waters were dangerous. Japanese patrol boats operated throughout Manila Bay and the passages beyond. The route to Mindanao was long and exposed, but staying on Corregidor was growing suicidally dangerous as well. The Japanese had been steadily intensifying their bombardment. The airfield was nearly unusable. Within days or weeks, the island would fall. The choice between immediate departure and imminent capture had collapsed into a single decision: go now. The men of Bataan knew nothing of this as the evening advanced. They knew their commander was across the bay on Corregidor. They knew the situation was deteriorating. Some senior commanders on Bataan had heard rumors that MacArthur might be ordered to leave, but rumors were currency in a dying garrison, and most were indistinguishable from wishful thinking or propaganda. The night of the 11th brought no special announcement, no gathering to hear parting words, no formal goodbye. At approximately 8:30 in the evening, MacArthur stepped aboard the PT-41 with his family and his immediate staff. The boat cast off into the darkness and began its journey south. The general who had commanded the defense of the Philippines since 1937, who had promised that the fortress would hold, who had told his men that relief was coming, was leaving them to their fate. By morning, his departure would be known. By midday, it would begin to poison the morale of every man who knew the name Douglas MacArthur. The journey itself was harrowing. The PT-41 cut through waters that Japanese aircraft and patrol boats controlled in daylight, racing against the dawn. The voyage to Mindanao took roughly 35 hours of continuous high-speed travel, with the boat's engines screaming, the crew tense, every man aboard aware that a single Japanese patrol, finding them in darkness, might end the entire enterprise in a moment of violence. The small family huddled below deck. MacArthur sat or stood in the cramped quarters, watching the darkness through portholes, feeling the lift and crash of the boat against the swells, knowing that with each passing hour, he was putting more distance between himself and the Philippines. There would be time, later, to think about what he was leaving behind. For now, there was only the hum of the engines and the black water and the race against the dawn. The PT-41 made it through. At dawn on the 12th of March, the boat pulled into Del Monte Field on Mindanao, a remote airstrip that had somehow remained in Allied hands, despite the Japanese conquest of most of the island. There was an old B-17 bomber waiting, and MacArthur and his party were loaded aboard. Within hours, they were airborne, climbing toward the south and Australia, leaving the Philippines behind. The moment the story became public, it detonated like a bomb among the troops on Bataan. By the morning of the 12th, rumors began to spread through the starving columns of soldiers that MacArthur had left the Philippines. At first, many refused to believe it. The general had sworn to hold the fortress. He had promised that help was coming, that Bataan would not fall, that they were fighting for victory, even though they were surrounded and outnumbered and running out of food. To believe that he had departed was to accept that all of that had been empty words. Denial gave way to anger. Some men wept with rage. Others sat in silence, processing the profound betrayal that MacArthur's departure represented. The men knew that generals were officers who made decisions and then lived with the consequences alongside their soldiers. The unspoken contract of military command was that you did not order men to die for a position and then save yourself when circumstances changed. You stood with them. You were the last to leave, or you did not leave at all. MacArthur had violated that contract in the starkest possible way. The knowledge spread through Bataan like poison through water. Yet the political leadership in Washington had made its choice, and it had been the right one, by the metrics of strategy and national interest. MacArthur's eventual return to the Philippines, his command of the vast Pacific War theater, his orchestration of the island-hopping campaign that would bring American power westward across the Pacific, all of this justified the decision from a historical and operational perspective. He would not have accomplished any of that if he had remained on Bataan and been captured by the Japanese. The calculus was not moral, it was functional. A dead or captured general cannot win wars. The men on Bataan would have to understand this, or they would die hating MacArthur, and many of them did both. The general accepted the burden of this knowledge with remarkable equanimity. He had not fought the order. He had not protested to Roosevelt. He had simply obeyed and departed, understanding that in a war of total national mobilization, even generals must serve the larger strategy rather than their own code of honor. The contradiction would haunt him, and it would haunt the men left behind for the rest of their lives. Before MacArthur left Corregidor, he had the foresight to prepare a statement that would be released after his departure. The statement was calculated, carefully worded, and designed to address precisely the charge of abandonment that he knew would be leveled against him. He understood public relations as few generals of his era did. He understood that narrative control mattered, that the story of why he left would shape how history judged his decision and his honor. The statement emphasized that he was leaving under direct presidential order, that he would not have departed otherwise, that he was doing so to prepare a return. The promise was embedded in the words, "I shall return," not someday, not eventually, but in the active future tense of military command. "I shall return." The phrase was a pledge made not to the American people but to the soldiers on Bataan and Corregidor, a promise that whatever happened in the next weeks or months or years, MacArthur would come back to the Philippines, would liberate the territory, would vindicate the men left behind. Whether he meant the phrase with full sincerity or understood its psychological utility, the statement struck the right register. It gave the men left behind something to hold on to, a narrative thread that connected MacArthur's departure to a future redemption rather than present abandonment. The phrase would become one of the most famous utterances of the entire war. As MacArthur flew toward Australia, command of the Philippine garrison passed to General Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright, a capable officer who now bore the impossible responsibility of defending territory that could not be defended with the resources available. Wainwright was not a celebrated figure like MacArthur. He had no personal mythology, no grand strategic vision, no carefully cultivated public image. He was a steady, professional soldier who had been MacArthur's second-in-command, and now he was left to preside over the death of the garrison. The men under his command would soon enough learn that they could expect no relief, no reinforcement, no evacuation. The order would come to surrender, and it would come not from Wainwright, but from General Edward King, commander of the Philippines' First Corps, who would make the agonizing decision to lay down arms when further resistance became mathematically impossible. Wainwright would surrender Corregidor in May, after weeks of additional bombardment, but for now, in mid-March, the command had simply changed hands. The garrison on Bataan was left to absorb the knowledge that their commander had gone, and a new one had taken his place. The narrative had shifted. What had been a campaign with a famous leader became, overnight, a rearguard action being managed by a competent but unknown officer. The men felt the difference in the air itself. The psychological toll of MacArthur's departure cannot be overstated. In an army that was already broken by 2 months of retreat and defeat, that was starving and diseased, that had watched every promise of reinforcement evaporate into wishful thinking, the news that their commanding general had fled the Philippines landed like one more catastrophe in an unending sequence of disasters. Some men felt abandoned, others felt angry. A few understood, at some level, that the decision made strategic sense, that MacArthur was more valuable to the war effort in Australia than rotting in a Japanese prison camp. But understanding is not the same as accepting, and acceptance is not the same as forgetting. The men on Bataan would carry the memory of this moment, this knowledge that when circumstances became dire enough, even generals saved themselves. The lesson was not lost on anyone. If there is to be escape, you must arrange it yourself. Loyalty flows downward from commander to soldier, but the reverse is not always reliable. In the weeks that followed, as food became more scarce and disease more prevalent, as it became clear that no relief was coming and surrender was not far away, the men remembered that MacArthur had gone. They would survive the march and the camps and the years of captivity, and they would carry that memory with them for decades, some of them for the rest of their lives. Yet history would remember MacArthur's departure and his promise differently than the soldiers who lived through it. The phrase, "I shall return," would take on prophetic weight as the years passed, as MacArthur's career continued upward, as his return to the Philippines in 1944 would be carefully staged and photographed and disseminated to the American public as a moment of triumph and redemption. The soldiers who had actually lived through Bataan would see the images of MacArthur wading ashore in his aviator sunglasses and military cap, and they would remember the beach at Mariveles, where the Death March began, the Japanese guards, the thirst, the men who did not survive. They would remember that MacArthur had left them, and they would understand that his return was not for them, but for history, for strategy, for the completion of his own narrative. The separation between the mythological MacArthur and the real one, between the promise and the experience, would become one of the war's enduring fractures. Some men would come to accept it or forgive it. Others would carry resentment to their graves. What none of them could deny was that on the night of the 11th of March, 1942, their commander had departed, leaving them to whatever fate awaited them on the peninsula of Bataan, in the camps beyond it, and in the long journey home that none of them yet understood was going to define the rest of their lives. Chapter 8. The Final Offensive. By the first week of April in 1942, the Japanese army had made a decision that would seal the fate of Bataan. General Masaharu Homma, the commander of the Japanese invasion force, had been reinforced with fresh divisions, artillery batteries, and aircraft that turned what had been a grinding stalemate into a military mismatch. The men of Bataan did not know it yet, but they were about to face the moment they had been dreading since the day they crossed the peninsula's northern boundary 3 months earlier, the moment when their depleted, starving garrison would finally break under concentrated assault. On the 3rd of April 1942, the Japanese opened their final offensive with a barrage that echoed across the peninsula like a funeral knell. The artillery came first, batteries of field guns and howitzers that had been carefully positioned during the preceding weeks, their muzzles trained on the American and Filipino lines that now held the central spine of Bataan, like a failing spine trying to hold up a dying body. The bombardment was methodical, relentless, and utterly overwhelming compared to anything the defenders had endured. After 3 months of relative quiet in the artillery war, the sudden violence seemed almost apocalyptic to men whose nerves had already been worn thin by hunger, disease, and the grinding knowledge that no relief was coming. The defensive line that broke first was held by the Toint Corps under the command of General Edward King, a career officer whose tall frame and weathered face bore the marks of months spent on inadequate rations and under impossible circumstances. King's men occupied the eastern flank of Bataan's defensive line, stretching from the coast inland through terrain that offered few natural advantages and fewer defensive positions that had been adequately prepared. Many of the soldiers holding that line were from the Philippine army, hastily conscripted peasants and townspeople who had received only weeks of training before being pressed into combat against a professional, equipped, and now massively reinforced enemy. When the bombardment lifted and the Japanese infantry assault began, the Filipino soldiers bore the brunt of the first waves. They were brave, but they were exhausted, hungry, and terrified in ways that training could never adequately prepare a man for. Under the weight of concentrated fire and wave after wave of enemy infantrymen, the line began to fracture almost immediately. Entire units lost cohesion, not through cowardice, but through the simple mechanical failure of men whose bodies were no longer capable of sustaining the effort required to fight and hold ground against overwhelming odds. The speed of the collapse shocked even King himself, who had prepared contingency plans, but harbored the faint, almost desperate hope that his men might somehow hold for another few weeks, buying time for something, anything, to change the strategic calculus of the Pacific War. It did not. Within hours of the initial assault, Filipino defenders began falling back, and that withdrawal became a rout. The Americans inserted their reserves to try to stiffen the line, committing company after company to desperate counterattacks, designed more to buy time than to hold ground. These counterattacks were acts of physical courage, performed by men whose bodies were already running on empty, driven forward by officers who knew the mathematics of their situation, but fought anyway, because that was what soldiers did. In one instance after another, small groups of American and Filipino troops would mount an assault against Japanese positions, inflict casualties that would have seemed significant under normal circumstances, and then run out of momentum and fall back before the weight of Japanese fire and numerical superiority. The Japanese, by contrast, were arriving fresh, well-fed, and equipped with ammunition that seemed endless compared to the meager supplies the defenders could portion out to each rifle squad. Every counterattack, no matter how bravely conducted, ended the same way, with American and Filipino troops withdrawing, carrying their wounded when they could, and preparing to make another stand at the next defensible position further north. The terrain of Bataan, which had provided some advantage to the defenders in a static defensive war, now became a liability in a war of mobile retreat. The peninsula narrowed toward the north, and every position that was abandoned meant the perimeter shrank and the front line grew shorter, which benefited the Japanese, who could concentrate their forces with devastating effect at chosen points of attack. By April the 4th, less than 30 hours after the offensive began, King realized that his Second Corps line had been broken beyond any immediate possibility of repair. The northern boundary of his defensive sector was collapsing as Japanese forces pushed through, and the units holding the western side of the peninsula under General Clifford Blumel were in only slightly better condition. King's options had narrowed to two: either attempt a last-ditch counteroffensive that would almost certainly be slaughtered to no strategic effect, or begin planning an orderly retreat that might preserve enough combat strength to make a final stand somewhere else. Neither option offered any real hope of victory or even meaningful delay. The Japanese had achieved numerical and material superiority at precisely the moment when Bataan's defenders were at their absolute nadir of strength and morale. Men who had been reduced to quarter rations were now expected to fight off 3 times their number in assault troops, supported by unlimited artillery. The mathematics were not merely unfavorable, they were simply impossible. What made the collapse even more psychologically devastating was the knowledge, now spreading through the Filipino and American ranks like a fever, that this was not a temporary setback to be countered by some strategic masterstroke from higher command. There was no corps of fresh divisions waiting to be unleashed. There was no secret weapon, no reinforcement convoy steaming toward Manila Bay under heavy escort, no brilliant tactical maneuver that MacArthur would soon order to turn the tide of battle. MacArthur himself had disappeared 3 weeks earlier into the night aboard a PT boat, his departure marking the moment when the men of Bataan truly understood they were on their own. Wainwright, his successor, was an able officer, but he was in Manila, overseeing the defense of the other islands, and unable to conduct the tactical battle from the front lines of Bataan. The men in the trenches, now collapsing under Japanese assault, knew that they were simply being ground down, that the offensive they faced was not designed to maneuver around them, but to break them, and that there was no reprieve coming. The psychological weight of that knowledge pressed down on soldiers, already weakened by hunger and disease, making every withdrawal feel less like a tactical maneuver and more like a route toward inevitable defeat. By April the 5th, the Japanese had succeeded in a major penetration of the defensive line in several sectors, and King was forced to issue orders for a general withdrawal to a new defensive position further north. This new line was hastily prepared and weakly garrisoned, but at this point, King was simply trying to preserve anything resembling organized resistance rather than to meaningfully slow the Japanese advance. The problem was that organized resistance was becoming almost impossible to maintain. Officers reported that entire units were fragmenting, that men were simply disappearing from the line during withdrawals, not deserting in the traditional sense, but rather collapsing from hunger and exhaustion and simply being left behind because there was no one to carry them and they could not walk any further. The regimental and divisional commanders were receiving requests from their battalion commanders that were less like military orders and more like desperate pleas for permission to break contact and save their men. The situation was rapidly ceasing to be a tactical problem and becoming an existential one. King understood that he was watching the final moments of organized American and Filipino military resistance in the Philippines. The question was no longer whether Bataan would fall, that outcome was now certain, but rather when it would fall and what would be the human cost of the final days of combat. The counterattacks continued through April the 6th and 7th, growing smaller and less coordinated, as each one consumed more men and equipment that could not be replaced. American and Filipino soldiers were now fighting almost in desperation, not because they believed they might win, but because they had been trained to hold their ground, and they could not bring themselves to stop fighting as long as their officers continued to place them in the line. There were acts of extraordinary bravery and sacrifice, individuals and small units who held positions to the last man rather than abandon their posts, who charged into Japanese fire, knowing they could not possibly succeed, who did so not for any strategic objective, but simply because that was what their training and their pride required. These were the actions of men who had absorbed the military culture of the 1940s, a culture that demanded sacrifice and endurance, almost without regard for whether that sacrifice would accomplish anything tactically meaningful. By April the 8th, it was clear to every senior commander on Bataan that the game was over. King had lost perhaps 40% of his effective fighting strength in the preceding 5 days. His supply of ammunition was depleted to the point where he could issue only a few rounds per rifle. His hospitals, already overflowing with malaria and dysentery cases before the offensive began, were now overwhelmed with wounded men who could not be treated, could not be evacuated, and could not even be given adequate water or food while they lay on the floors of makeshift aid stations. The artillery that had once provided some defensive firepower was nearly silent, its guns limited to a few rounds per day, because ammunition was so scarce that King and his staff had to make impossible decisions about where to concentrate the remaining shells. On the morning of April the 9th, 1942, General King made the decision that would define the remainder of his life and the lives of tens of thousands of men under his command. He called his senior officers together in his headquarters and informed them that he had decided to surrender. There was no dramatic confrontation, no rebellion from subordinates who believed they might continue fighting. Instead, there was something closer to a collective exhalation, a release of the terrible tension that had been building since the first Japanese shells fell 4 days earlier. King sent out feelers to the Japanese commanders, and after several hours of negotiation, arrangements were made for the American and Filipino forces to lay down their weapons. King did not know it yet, but he was about to make the largest capitulation in American military history, involving more than 75,000 Filipino and American soldiers passing into Japanese captivity in a single day. He was also about to set the stage for one of the darkest chapters in the Pacific War, an event that would eventually become known as the Bataan Death March, a nightmare that would last for weeks and cost thousands of lives. But in that moment, on the morning of April the 9th, all King could see was that he had exhausted his options, that his men were starving and dying, and that continuing to fight would accomplish nothing except to add more names to the casualty rolls without changing the outcome. He signed the surrender order, and somewhere in the Japanese lines, officers received word that the American and Filipino forces on Bataan were giving up. The war in the Philippines was entering its final phase, but for the men who would soon begin the march northward, the true nightmare was just beginning. By the first week of April in 1942, the men of Bataan had been starving for 3 months. Their rations had contracted from 1 pound of rice per man per day to half that, then to a quarter, and in some units, mere handfuls of corn mixed with grass and bark. The Japanese offensive that began on the 3rd of April swept through the Filipino and American lines with a force that exhausted defenders could not withstand. They had no reserves left to call upon. They had no air support. They had no reinforcements coming from anywhere. What they had was hunger, fever, and the knowledge that they were about to lose. By the evening of the 8th of April, General Edward King understood that his command was finished. The organized lines had collapsed. Discipline was fragmenting. Men were beginning to wander or hide rather than fight. King was facing a choice that no commander ever wants to face, and certainly no American commander in the 20th century had faced it on this scale before. He could order his men to fight to the last and watch them die in dribs and drabs over weeks, hunted across a peninsula with no supplies and nowhere to go. Or he could surrender them and hope that the conventions of war meant something, that the Japanese would honor the laws that governed the treatment of prisoners. That was the choice before General Edward King on the morning of the 9th of April. King did not make this decision in isolation or in defiance. Earlier that morning, he had sent a radio message to General Jonathan Wainwright, who had assumed overall command when MacArthur left for Australia. The message was brief and brutal. King said that organized resistance was no longer possible. He asked for permission to surrender. Wainwright, receiving the message, was devastated. He ordered King to continue fighting, not because it would change anything militarily, but because he was still bound by the chain of command, and by the hope that some American authority would never voluntarily hand over American soldiers to a foreign power. But Wainwright also knew that he was not on Bataan. He was not seeing the state of the men with his own eyes. King was. The radio crackled with the weight of that distance, that unbridgeable gap between the decision-maker in a command post on Corregidor and the commander standing amid thousands of starving, disease-stricken men who could no longer fight. King listened to Wainwright's order, and then he made his own decision. History would judge him for it. Wainwright would feel the sting of it for years afterward. But King understood that the men in front of him were going to die regardless. The only question was whether they would die in some fashion that preserved their dignity, or whether they would be hunted like animals across a hostile peninsula until the last one fell. By early morning, on the 9th of April, white flags began appearing over the American positions. Officers watched them rise with a feeling that was difficult to name. Relief mixed with shame, sorrow mixed with something almost like release. The men who saw the flags react with quiet disbelief. After months of holding ground, of enduring impossible conditions, of believing that somehow, against reason and evidence, they would be rescued or relieved, the reality suddenly became concrete. They were going to surrender. They were going to be prisoners. The sun was already hot. The flies were already gathering. And in a few hours, they would no longer be soldiers. They would be captives. The weight of that knowledge settled over the peninsula like ash. Some men wept. Some sat in stunned silence. Some stripped themselves of anything that might mark them as soldiers, removed insignia, hid documents, as if that small defiance against the inevitable might protect them somehow. The Filipino troops understood what was happening. Many of them had fought beside American soldiers for months. Now those soldiers were giving up, and the question of what happened to the Filipino soldiers was murky and undefined. The Filipino scouts, who were American soldiers in everything but citizenship, faced the same uncertainty as their American counterparts. The conscripts of the Philippine army, men who had been civilians only months before, simply tried to process that their war was over. They had done what was asked of them. Now they would face whatever came next. General King moved through the morning with the bearing of a man who had accepted the worst outcome, but was determined to face it with discipline and clarity. He was a career officer who understood the codes of military conduct, understood that surrender was a moment fraught with danger. Japanese soldiers who had been fighting Filipino and American forces for weeks did not distinguish between soldiers and enemies. To them, the men in front of them had been trying to kill them, and those men had failed. The defeated enemy was always vulnerable to the victor's rage. King had to negotiate with the Japanese, not just the terms of surrender, but the safety of the men who would pass into custody. Early that morning, he sent a delegation under a flag of truce toward the Japanese lines to request a meeting with the senior Japanese commander. The delegation moved through the surreal landscape of Bataan, abandoned equipment, scattered bodies, the physical detritus of a military force in collapse. They carried their white flag and their fear, knowing that Japanese soldiers had been known to fire on men under flags of truce, knowing that this moment was fragile and could shatter without warning. The meeting took place near the small village of Balanga, on a road that would soon become the starting point for tens of thousands of men, beginning a journey they did not understand. King met with Japanese officers, including Major Katsutaro Kimura, who would become the face of Japanese command authority during the surrender. The conversation had to bridge languages and cultures, had to express concepts that were not entirely comfortable in either military tradition. King requested, explicitly and directly, that the Japanese treat the surrendered soldiers humanely. He asked that the wounded be cared for. He asked that water and food be provided. He asked that the soldiers be allowed to move in organized groups with medical attention available. He was not pleading. He was not begging. He was a general officer stating the conditions that needed to be met if the surrender was to take place. Whether King truly believed the Japanese would honor these requests, or whether he was simply placing on the record what ought to happen, is a question that has echoed through 7 decades of argument and legal proceeding. The Japanese officers listened. They appeared to acknowledge what King was requesting. The surrender was accepted. Roughly 75,000 men. The exact numbers were difficult to calculate in the chaos of collapse, would be transferred to Japanese custody. It was the largest capitulation of an American-led military force in the history of the United States Army. By noon on the 9th of April, the men of Bataan were ordered to assemble at designated points and prepare to march. Some units moved with military precision still intact. Officers maintained formation and discipline, trying to impose order on an event that felt like the end of order itself. Other units were already so fragmented that assembly was nearly impossible. Men who had been hiding in caves or abandoned positions emerged slowly, wary, unsure if the war was truly over or if this was some kind of trap. The Japanese began moving through the area with trucks and marching columns, herding prisoners toward collection points. No one knew what came next. No one knew where they were being taken or what the duration of their captivity might be. Some men thought they would be marched a short distance and then released, that perhaps the Japanese would send them home. Others understood, with a darker clarity, that this was the beginning of something that might last indefinitely. The temperature was climbing into the 80s, and then the 90s. The roads were thick with dust, and the columns of prisoners began to form. Thousands of men in rows, walking north, away from Bataan, away from the peninsula they had defended, toward an unknown destination and an uncertain fate. The sound of those columns, the shuffle of feet, the whispered conversations, the occasional order from an officer trying to maintain some fragment of military structure, would become the soundtrack of history's most catastrophic forced march. But none of them knew that yet. None of them understood that the nightmare was only beginning. King watched the march begin. He was marched with his men, as protocol required. He was not separated or given any special treatment. He experienced the same road, the same sun, the same denial of water that his soldiers experienced. When the march was finished, when the prisoners arrived at Camp O'Donnell days later, King had lost significant weight and his health was shattered. He would survive the war, would return to the United States, would live to see the post-war trials and the verdicts handed down against Japanese commanders, but he would never fully escape the knowledge of the decision he made on the 9th of April. In the years that followed, King's decision would be scrutinized, criticized, and defended by historians, by fellow officers, and by survivors who had been in those columns. Some would argue that he surrendered too early, that he should have fought on despite the impossibility. Others would argue that he did the only thing a commander could do when the moment had come. The truth, as is often the case with impossible choices, contained elements of both. King did what the circumstances demanded. He could not have done anything else, but the cost of that decision, paid by 75,000 men over the following 3 years, would become one of the darkest chapters in American military history. The surrender itself was clean and ordered, but everything that followed was anything but. The moment of surrender was also the moment when the men of Bataan discovered what it meant to be defenseless prisoners in the hands of an enemy that had not prepared to receive them, that did not want to feed them, that regarded them with a mixture of contempt and rage. The Japanese army had expected to defeat the American and Filipino forces on Bataan. What it had not expected was how long it would take, or how many soldiers would be left to surrender when the fighting was finished. Japanese logistics had never accounted for 75,000 prisoners. Japanese discipline had not been conditioned to treat defeated enemies with restraint, particularly enemies that had fought as hard and for as long as the men of Bataan had fought. Japanese culture, with its codes of military honor that made surrender itself a form of shame, did not extend humanitarian dignity to men who had laid down their weapons. All of these factors collided at Mariveles, at Balanga, at 100 collection points across the peninsula, in the moment immediately after the white flags went up and the guns fell silent. The men who had been soldiers minutes before were now in a state they had not anticipated and could not escape. They were prisoners of war, held by an enemy whose understanding of the rules and conventions governing prisoners of war was fundamentally different from their own. That difference would kill thousands. The early hours after the surrender dissolved into a confusion of marching, assembly, and the first arbitrary acts of violence that would characterize the next few days. Japanese soldiers who had just fought their way across Bataan were not immediately given orders on how to treat prisoners. Some acted with military discipline. Others acted on impulse and anger. Men were struck for minor infractions or for no infraction at all. Personal possessions were taken: watches, rings, wallets, letters from home. These were not just thefts. They were symbolic acts of stripping identity, of reducing soldiers to the status of objects under complete control of a power that now held them. The Japanese divided the columns by nationality. American soldiers were separated from Filipino soldiers, though the separation was never absolute and not always enforced. The Americans were told they were being marched north. The Filipinos were told the same thing, though for many of them, the march would be even more deadly. A few Filipinos were allowed to leave immediately, released to the local population, though it was never clear why some were released and others were not. The uncertainty itself was part of the disorientation that overtook the prisoners. Nothing made sense. Nothing could be predicted. The only constant was the sun, the heat, the dust, and the presence of guards who seemed indifferent to whether the prisoners lived or died. General King experienced it with the men because he chose to. He could have requested separate treatment as a general officer. Some commanders would have. But King understood that his place was with his soldiers, or as many of them as he could influence and support through what was coming. His presence in the columns had meaning. It said that officers were not abandoning enlisted men, that rank had not separated anyone from the experience of defeat. It also made King a witness. He saw what happened in the early hours of the march. He could not prevent it, but he could observe it, could remember it, could testify to it later when the time came for accounting. The image that would remain with him, and that would be carried forward into the historical record, was of thousands of men, starved and sick before the march even began, beginning a journey without food, without water, without rest, without any certainty they would reach the destination alive. King had made the decision to surrender, to spare them the death that continued combat would bring. What King could not have predicted, and what made history brutal in ways that transcended military logic, was that surrender would not spare them. It would merely transform the manner of death from combat to something slower, more methodical, more deliberate, through neglect. By the afternoon of the 9th of April, the marching had begun in earnest. The columns stretched across the roads of Luzon, moving north from the southern tip of Bataan towards San Fernando, a distance that would be covered not in days, but in what would become an infamous trajectory of suffering, measured in lives lost per mile of road traveled. The men did not know at first that they were beginning what would be called the Death March. They were simply moving, following the prisoner in front of them, thirst mounting with each hour, the sun showing no mercy, and the guards making it clear through their actions and their indifference that a man could fall behind and no one would care. Some men tried to help each other, some men focused only on survival, and some men, by the end of that first day, were already beginning to understand that General King's decision to surrender, made with the best intentions and the most rational analysis available to him, had placed them in the hands of something that could not be negotiated with or influenced through the appeals of the Geneva Convention or the codes of military honor. They were in Japanese hands now, and Japanese hands were not gentle. The march had begun, and no one could foresee how far it would go or how many would not reach the end alive. On the 9th of April, 1942, as the ink dried on General Edward King's surrender document, Roughly 75,000 Filipino and American soldiers began to grasp the enormity of what had just occurred. They were no longer defenders of anything. They were prisoners. The machinery of their captivity would not wait for orders from Tokyo or for any semblance of organized protocol. It would begin immediately, in the suffocating heat of Bataan's southern tip, where tens of thousands of men were herded into the open around the small barrio of Mariveles, like cattle being sorted at a slaughterhouse. The Japanese commander, General Masaharu Honma, had issued orders for the prisoners to be moved northward to Camp O'Donnell. What he did not issue, or what his subordinates chose to disregard, were the logistical arrangements necessary to move such a vast human tide across the length of a peninsula in an equatorial climate, with no water, no food, and no mercy. The prisoners began to assemble at Mariveles in the early morning hours after the surrender, their uniforms tattered, their faces burnt by months of tropical sun, their ribs visible through their shirts. Many had lost 20, 30, even 50 pounds since January. They had been living on 1/3 rations in December, then quarter rations, then barely anything at all. The Japanese did not know this, or rather, the Japanese did not care. To the guards who now controlled them, these men were enemy soldiers, and enemy soldiers received what enemy soldiers deserved. The order came down that the prisoners should be assembled and ready to march by dawn. As the sun climbed higher on that 9th day of April, the temperature climbed with it, and the prisoners stood in the open with no shade, no water stations, no shelters, no shade cloth, nothing. They stood pressed together in the growing heat, and no one told them where they were going or how long the journey would take. No one told them anything at all. What happened in those first hours set the tone for everything that followed. Japanese guards moved through the columns of prisoners, confiscating anything of value: watches, rings, pens, photographs, letters. All of it disappeared into the pockets of men who had been given implicit permission to take whatever they wanted. Brutality was not systematic at first. It was incidental, almost casual. A soldier moved too slowly out of the assembly area, and a guard would strike him with a rifle butt, a fist, whatever was at hand. A man tried to hold on to a photograph of his family, and the guard would rip it away and beat him until he let go. These acts were not the product of deliberate torture protocol. They were the product of contempt. The Japanese had been trained to view prisoners with disdain, to see their surrender as a moral failure, and they expressed that disdain through violence that required no orders and no permission. It simply happened, as routinely as the sun rising over the peninsula. The columns began to form in the middle of the morning, and it became clear that the Japanese had made no provisions whatsoever for moving such a large number of prisoners. There were no trucks, no supply vehicles following behind with food and water. The prisoners would march on foot, in groups of roughly 100 at a time, moving northward under guard toward an undefined destination. The distance was approximately 40 kilometers, though no one was told this. For men who had been eating less than 1,000 calories a day for months, for men already ravaged by malaria and dysentery, for men whose skin was blistered and whose feet were swollen, that distance might as well have been the whole world. The first groups began moving out in late morning. The sun was already fierce. The road ahead was a ribbon of white coral dust, and the temperature was climbing steadily toward what would be the most murderous heat of the year, a heat that would push 110 degrees and above before the day was done. The prisoners who marched in those early groups did not fully understand what was happening to them. They knew they were captured. They had surrendered. They expected to be moved, to be confined, to be treated poorly. War had taught them that much. but nothing in their experience had prepared them for the deliberate indifference to their survival that characterized the Japanese command of the march. There was no assumption that prisoners should be kept alive and fit for labor. There was no belief that feeding them was a practical necessity. There was only the desire to move them northward as quickly as possible, and if men died in the process, that was simply the cost of victory. Some of the guards were combat soldiers, worn and traumatized by their own ordeal on Bataan. Others were drafted from rear echelon units, men who had never engaged in combat and who now wielded authority over defeated enemies with the swagger of the suddenly powerful. All of them had been fed repeatedly with propaganda that depicted Allied soldiers as subhuman, as deserving of whatever befell them. That ideology, that cultural permission to brutalize, now met the physical reality of 75,000 starving men in an impossible situation. The march out of Mariveles on that first day was chaos masquerading as organization. Guards shouted orders in Japanese that the prisoners could not understand. Men who stumbled or moved too slowly were beaten. The guards had no means of knowing how to maintain column discipline over such numbers in such conditions. They simply reacted to any deviation from immediate obedience with violence. As the miles accumulated, men began to suffer from the heat and the exertion almost immediately. Many had not walked more than a few hundred meters in months, weakened as they were by siege conditions and starvation. The rhythm of the march, forward, always forward, with brief halts under the sun that provided no relief, was designed to move bodies, not to preserve them. By midday, men were beginning to suffer from heat exhaustion. By afternoon, some were collapsing. When a man fell, the guards did not stop the column. They would beat the collapsed prisoner, trying to force him to rise, and when he could not, they would strike him repeatedly and leave him behind, dying in the dust. The Filipino prisoners and the American prisoners marched together, though there was no formal distinction made. What separated them was geography and fate. Filipino conscripts from the Philippine army units had homes and families that were sometimes visible from the marching routes, homes they would pass without being able to stop, houses where they might hear a relative's voice or catch a glimpse of someone they loved before being beaten forward. For them, the march was not just a trial of endurance, but a specific torture of proximity to the life they had lost. American soldiers, by contrast, were alien in every respect. They could not communicate with most of the guards in any language. They could not appeal to any shared cultural understanding. They were simply enemies, foreigners, defeated invaders, and they would be treated with that knowledge in mind. Yet both groups shared a common physical ordeal that would bind them together in a way that rank and nationality could not separate. Water became the obsession almost immediately. The human body cannot function without water, and the guards had provided none. In the brutal heat of the Luzon plain, with the temperature climbing and the sweat flowing from exhausted men, the absence of water was not merely uncomfortable, it was lethal. Some prisoners drank from the few carabao wallows they passed, filthy pools where water buffalo cooled themselves in mud and filth. Those men often vomited within hours, their dehydrated systems unable to process the contaminated liquid, but they had no choice. To drink from a carabao wallow was to risk dysentery, but not to drink at all was to die within hours. The calculation was grim and immediate. Men began to fall with heat stroke. Their skin turned purple red. Their bodies stopped functioning. Some died on the road. Others were left behind by guards, who moved the column forward and did not count the prisoners as they passed a certain point. The first day of the march consumed more men than anyone could accurately record, but survivors would later estimate that hundreds died before the first night fell. The prisoners' possessions had already been stripped away at Mariveles. but the march itself became a process of losing everything else. Men's boots, worn and rotted from months in wet trenches, literally fell apart on their feet, and when they fell apart, the men continued marching barefoot on coral roads that cut their souls open and left them bleeding with each step. Those who could not walk barefoot fast enough were beaten. Canteens that had somehow survived until this point were taken by guards or were lost and never recovered. Any scrap of cloth that might have shaded a man's sunburned neck or protected his blistered feet was stolen or fell away. The march methodically stripped the prisoners of every material resource they possessed and replaced it with nothing. By nightfall, when the columns were finally halted in open fields with no shelter and no sanitation facilities, the men who had started the day were unrecognizable to themselves. The nights were almost as brutal as the days. The prisoners were packed together in fields or open areas, with no roof, no blankets, no latrine facilities. The dysentery and other intestinal diseases that had been spreading through the starving prisoners on Bataan accelerated catastrophically. Men who could barely stand defecated where they collapsed. The smell became overwhelming. The sanitation became non-existent. Flies swarmed over everything. Mosquitoes descended at dusk, and malaria-carrying anopheles fed on the exhausted men throughout the night. There was no rest, because rest required lying down, and lying down meant lying in feces and filth. Men sat in the darkness, delirious from fever and dehydration, trying not to lose consciousness, because losing consciousness meant falling over into the surrounding excrement. Some men died during the night. Their bodies were discovered in the morning, sometimes with their faces in the mud, sometimes simply motionless among the sitting men who had watched them go. When the sun rose again, the survivors were roused and the march resumed, and more men fell with every kilometer that passed. The Japanese guards, by contrast, were fed regularly. They had access to water. They moved through the chaos around them with an almost ceremonial indifference to the suffering they were witnessing and perpetrating. Some of them were sadistic, men who enjoyed the authority and the violence. Others were simply following orders and maintaining discipline through whatever means were at hand. The guards did not see men who were dying of thirst. They saw prisoners who were not moving fast enough. They did not see the impact of starvation on the human body. They saw soldiers who were slowing down the march. The gap between the condition of the guards and the condition of the prisoners became another kind of violence, a constant reminder that some men had food and water and shelter, while others had nothing at all. By the time the columns reached Balanga, roughly 30 kilometers north of Mariveles, the march had already claimed an incalculable number of lives. Some estimates would later suggest that more than 500 men had died in that first segment alone, though no accurate count was ever made. The prisoners were herded into a small town that had no capacity to hold them, no food to feed them, no water to give them. Balanga became a holding point where prisoners were organized and reorganized, where guards continued to beat them, where more men died from heat exhaustion, dysentery, and the compounding effects of starvation and trauma. Some prisoners had managed to trade with Filipino civilians who approached the columns at terrible personal risk, passing small amounts of food, a handful of rice, a piece of palm fruit, through the guards' lines in exchange for anything of value the prisoners still possessed. Those small gestures of humanity became precious memories for men who had entered a world where such kindness was rarer than water. The first segment of the Death March, from Mariveles to Balanga, set the pattern that would continue north toward San Fernando, and then toward the final destination of Camp O'Donnell. It was a pattern of systematic brutality, created not by deliberate planning, but by the intersection of Japanese contempt for defeated enemies, the complete absence of logistical preparation, The crushing physical conditions of the Luzon Plain in April, and the already desperate health status of men who had been starving for months. The prisoners were expected to move quickly, to make no trouble, to die quietly if they must die, and to do all of this without food, without water, without mercy, without shelter, and without anyone keeping track of how many of them survived the journey. What had begun at Mariveles was not a march. It was a slow-motion execution, disguised as logistics, and it was only beginning. The road north from Mariveles was not merely a route, it was a filter. The Japanese command had assembled more than 70,000 prisoners in a landscape designed by nature to kill slowly, and the design was working. No elaborate mechanism of execution was necessary. The sun, the dust, the absence of water, and the will of men to survive would accomplish what bullets alone could not. By the end of the first full day of movement, the columns had already begun to thin. The screams came first, men whose legs simply would not carry them further, or whose minds had begun to slip. Then came the thud of rifle butts, then silence. The columns pressed on. Those who remained learned quickly that looking back was dangerous. Sympathy had become a luxury no one could afford. The Luzon Plain in April is a furnace. The temperature climbed past 105 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-morning, and the humidity turned sweat into a useless film on skin that offered no cooling. The prisoners were arranged into columns that stretched for miles. Some estimates suggest the main column extended more than 20 kilometers, and the men in the center could neither see the front nor the back. They knew only the dust churned up by the feet of those ahead, a brown cloud so thick it clogged the nose and throat and turned sweat into mud on the face. Thousands of men who had not had a full meal in months were now being forced to march for hours in this furnace. The reserves of strength that had kept them alive through the Bataan siege began to empty with each kilometer. The guards did not count the paces. The guards did not need to. They simply followed the trail of men who could not keep up, and dealt with them according to patterns established in those first brutal hours. Water became the obsession that overwrote all others. In the early hours of the march, prisoners were told they would reach a rest stop and receive food and water. That information proved to be a fiction. Hours passed. The columns halted in open ground, offered nothing, and then resumed. Men began to hallucinate. The mind under extreme thirst does strange things. It produces mirages, not of lakes and rivers, but of specific memories. A soldier from Nebraska thought he could smell the rain on his mother's garden. A Filipino sergeant could taste the cool well water from his childhood village. These were not comfort, they were torment. As the hours became a full day, and the full day began to stretch toward a second, the desperation grew animal. Prisoners spotted carabao wallows, stagnant pools of water where water buffalo had stood in their own waste. Men who would have recoiled from such things in a world that made sense now drank deeply, even knowing the water was contaminated, knowing dysentery would follow within hours or days. The choice was abstract, the thirst was immediate. The march would not slow for sickness. The Japanese guards moved through the columns on horseback or on foot with rifles and swords. The pattern of violence, once established, became almost mechanical. A man would stumble, he would fall. If he could rise quickly, the guards might not notice. If he could not, if he slowed the man behind him, if he seemed to hesitate, then the sword would come out, or the rifle would crack down. The violence was not administered with rage. That would have required energy the guards themselves were expending in the heat. It was administered as routine, the way a farmer might deal with a beast that has gone lame. Some guards seemed to take satisfaction in it. Others appeared merely to be doing their job. The prisoners could not afford to distinguish. They only knew that to fall was to die, and that knowledge became the mechanism that kept even the weakest moving. The fear was more powerful than the legs. The mind that wanted to quit, the body that continued to move. This was the central negotiation happening in the mind of every man still standing. Yet there were counterforces. The columns passed through towns and villages, where Filipino civilians had gathered, drawn by word that the American prisoners were being marched northward. Families came with water and food, risking beatings, or worse, to hold out containers to men they had never met. A Filipino woman pressed a piece of fruit into the hand of a soldier who had never set foot in her province before that moment. A farmer's son stepped out with a canteen of water and was struck down by a guard for the gesture. Other prisoners saw this. They understood what it meant. The Japanese had conquered the Philippines, but they had not conquered the willingness of civilians to defy them in these small, perilous acts. The food that made it through was distributed according to informal rules that the prisoners themselves policed. The man who needed it most went first. The man who was strongest might wait. In a system designed by the Japanese to strip away all human connection and reduce the prisoners to animals competing for survival, the prisoners themselves were rebuilding community in real time, in the margins of every halt and rest stop. The second day was worse than the first, because by the second day, the illusion that it would not last forever had burned away. These were not soldiers on a tactical march. These were not prisoners being transported to a destination where conditions might improve. These were men being walked to death in stages, and the process was already accelerating. The death toll on that second day exceeded anything seen in the first hours. By some estimates, more than 500 men died on the march itself, not in camps, but on the road, their bodies left behind for burial details that the Japanese sometimes insisted on and sometimes did not. The columns learned to step around them without breaking stride. They learned to register the sound of a body falling, but not to think about it. The psychological mechanism that allowed this was not moral collapse so much as necessity. To dwell on the death beside you was to slow your own pace. To slow your own pace was to court the same end. So men constructed internal walls. They narrowed their attention to the road immediately ahead. They set their minds on the next kilometer, the next hour, the next opportunity for water. Some men began to sing, very quietly, so as not to attract attention, old songs from before the war, before the Philippines, before any of this had meaning. The sound of human voices, reinforcing connection, in an environment designed to obliterate it. The march took roughly 9 days, from Mariveles in the south to San Fernando in the north, where the next stage of the nightmare, the boxcar transport, would begin. But those 9 days were not a single thing that happened and then ended. They were 9 separate climbs up a mountain that never revealed its peak. Each dawn was a new possibility of death. Each kilometer brought new terrain, new obstacles, new moments, where the will had to overcome the body's absolute refusal to continue. The guards maintained their pace without mercy. If a column of 75,000 men slowed, the entire operation would be disrupted. Japanese headquarters had deemed a certain pace acceptable, and that pace would be maintained regardless of how many men had to be left behind to do it. The mathematics were simple on paper. In practice, they were carried out by individual men holding rifles, making instantaneous decisions about whose life mattered and whose did not. The Filipino prisoners and the American prisoners marched together, though not always intermixed. Some Japanese officers seemed to regard them differently. The Filipinos as colonial subjects, which carried a different species of contempt than Americans received. Others treated all prisoners equally as subhuman. The Filipinos had the advantage of geographical knowledge and language. They recognized towns and villages and could sometimes trade with civilians when Americans could not. They also had the disadvantage of knowing what the Japanese occupation would mean for their families. American prisoners could console themselves with the hope that the United States would return. Many Filipino soldiers knew that return would not restore what had been lost. Yet they marched. Hour after hour they marched. The same water sources, the same heat, the same guards, the same calculus of survival repeated endlessly. By the fourth and fifth days, the physical condition of the men had begun to deteriorate in visible ways. Men who had survived months on Bataan on starvation rations were now being asked to march extended distances on 0 calories, while dehydrating in extreme heat. Their bodies began to consume themselves. The first symptom was often not weakness, but a kind of strange euphoria, the mind shutting down higher functions and approaching a kind of peace. Survivors would later report that in these moments they ceased to feel fear. They were simply moving, the body on autopilot, the mind somewhere else entirely. Some men in this state would suddenly sit down on the road. They would not speak. They would simply stop. For most of them, the guard's response came within seconds. For a few, it did not, and they sat in the dust while the column moved on, aware that they would not rise again, but somehow past the point of caring. The psychological cost of witnessing this, of being the one who kept walking while your companion did not, would echo through the rest of their lives. There were small mercies, moments that broke the overwhelming brutality into something almost human. A guard who signaled permission to drink from a stream. A Japanese officer who called a longer halt in the shade of palm trees. A Filipino civilian who came out with cloth and helped wrap a soldier's feet when blisters had become infected. These were not redemptions. They did not erase what was happening, but they existed, and men clung to them as proof that the universe had not entirely lost the capacity to offer mercy. The brain, under extreme stress, under the continuous expectation of death, develops a kind of selective awareness. The terrible things become background. The small kindnesses become luminous. A prisoner would remember the taste of that piece of fruit for the rest of his life. He would forget the screams of the men who fell that same day, or he would remember both, and the tension between them would never resolve. By the time the columns reached San Fernando, most prisoners had completed an ordeal that should have killed them. By objective measures, there was no reason any of them should have survived. Their bodies had been pushed past every known limit. Their minds had been asked to compartmentalize horrors that no theory of human psychology had anticipated, yet they had endured. The sun and dust and thirst had filtered out thousands, but the columns that arrived in San Fernando were still in the tens of thousands. Their appearance was that of men who had just emerged from a mass grave, but they had not yet surrendered to death. That was the quality that the Japanese command had not anticipated, or had deliberately tested. How far could human beings be pushed before something inside them simply failed? The Bataan prisoners were about to provide a terrible answer, not in complete failure, but in partial, costly, grudging survival that would carry its own profound weight. The final kilometers into San Fernando are remembered as the worst. The town was no longer hidden by distance. The prisoners could see it, could see the railroad depot where the next stage was being prepared. For some, the sight was renewal of hope. Surely the march was ending. Surely conditions would improve. For others, the knowledge that there was more to come, that this was not the destination but merely a waypoint, brought despair. The guards seemed to sense this psychological moment and pressed harder. Men who had reserves of strength they did not know they possessed drew on them. Men who had nothing left were carried by other men. Strange partnerships of survival, where a stronger prisoner would support a weakening one, knowing that if his companion fell, he himself would almost certainly be killed for failing to maintain pace. These acts of sacrifice, made without ceremony or record, in the dust and heat on a road now known to history only through the testimony of its survivors, were the hidden architecture of survival on the Bataan Death March. Not glory, not noble stands, just one human being, deciding, for reasons he could never fully articulate, that his own life was worth less than the continued existence of the man beside him. By the 24th of April, the survivors of the Bataan Death March had shuffled into San Fernando, a town that had once been home to civilians and commerce, but now served only as a processing point for the condemned. The soldiers who arrived here were no longer the men who had begun the march 6 days earlier at Mariveles. They were hollow-eyed wraiths, their uniforms hanging from frames that had shed flesh and bone with each passing kilometer. Some could barely stand without support. Others had collapsed entirely and were carried or dragged by comrades who understood that stopping meant death. The Japanese guards showed no sign of hurrying. They seemed almost curious about how much further these Americans and Filipinos could be broken before they simply ceased to function. In the town square and surrounding areas, Japanese officers pointed prisoners toward a railroad depot, away from the afternoon sun and toward a different kind of horror altogether. The promise of transport, the whisper that had kept some men moving, was about to be fulfilled in a way that transformed the march from an ordeal of walking into something far more claustrophobic and absolute. The railroad depot at San Fernando was a vision of bureaucratic cruelty rendered into physical space. Guards directed the exhausted prisoners into boxcars, old wooden freight cars designed to carry supplies or goods, never human beings, in any number approaching what was being forced inside. Men later testified that more than 100 prisoners were packed into cars meant for perhaps 20 or 30 at capacity. The air became a tangible substance almost immediately, thick, foul, difficult to breathe. Those who collapsed or fell were trampled by the weight of other bodies pressing in from behind. There was no water distributed before departure, no sanitation facilities of any kind. The guards sealed the doors from the outside. In the suffocating darkness, men began to die almost at once. Some fell to the floor and were simply absorbed by the mass of humanity. Others were asphyxiated by the sheer weight of bodies pressing against them. The journey to Capas, the town closest to the Camp O'Donnell location, covered a distance of roughly 35 kilometers, yet some cars took more than 12 hours to reach their destination. Prisoners later described it as being buried alive, conscious the entire time, aware of every crushing moment before the merciful release of unconsciousness or death. When the boxcar doors were finally opened at Capas, the prisoners who stumbled out into the relatively cleaner air had passed through another filter. Those strong enough to emerge into sunlight did so into a landscape they barely recognized, their senses so damaged by days of deprivation that the external world seemed to exist at a distance. The walk from Capas to Camp O'Donnell covered roughly 10 kilometers, and it continued the work the march and the boxcars had begun. Men fell to their knees in the roadside dust, some rising again with help from those nearby, others lying still until Japanese guards moved them off the path or left them entirely. The road itself seemed to hold no malice. It was simply a road, hot and dusty like any road in the Philippines at that time of year. But it had become, by virtue of being traveled by such broken men, another instrument of death. There was no water distribution on this final segment. The Japanese quartermaster corps had not arranged for medical stations or rest points. Each kilometer covered meant the removal of another layer of dignity from men who had already given away nearly everything. What kept them moving was no longer hope or the expectation of mercy. It was simply the understanding that stopping brought immediate violence from guards, and that collapse meant being left behind, or worse. Camp O'Donnell emerged from the landscape as an unfinished nightmare. It had been constructed as a training facility for the Philippine Army, a work in progress that had been abandoned when the Japanese conquered the islands. The camp consisted of rough barracks, open-air shelters, minimal sanitation facilities, and almost no infrastructure to support the influx of tens of thousands of prisoners that the Japanese military now forced inside its gates. No preparations had been made. No water distribution system had been installed. No medical facilities existed beyond a few makeshift structures that lacked beds, medicines, or bandages. The camp's design assumed thousands of residents. It received more than 7,000 in the first week alone, and continued to receive additional prisoners from other locations for weeks afterward. The Japanese commander, General Masaru Maeda, had received instructions to house and process the prisoners at Camp O'Donnell, but the scale of the assignment appeared to have been fundamentally underestimated, or, some historians have argued, deliberately left vague as a death sentence, camouflaged in bureaucratic language. The prisoners were divided into sections, some housed in the incomplete barracks, many others simply left in the open fields with no shelter at all from the tropical sun or the rain that came during the monsoon season. What followed in the first days after arrival was a mortality crisis that accelerated daily. Men who had survived the march itself, who had walked 80 kilometers without adequate food or water, who had endured the boxcars, fell to cholera, dysentery, malaria, and a form of acute dehydration and starvation that left the body unable to resist any infection. The water supply at Camp O'Donnell became immediately contaminated. The camp's latrine system, such as it existed, did nothing to prevent waste from seeping into the water sources that the prisoners relied on for drinking and, when possible, washing. Men drank water that tasted of feces and sickness, knowing it was contaminated, knowing that drinking it meant probable death within days, and drinking it anyway, because the alternative was dying of thirst within hours. The medical situation was catastrophic. Dr. Alfred Weinstein, one of the senior American medical officers at the camp, later estimated that in the first month of O'Donnell's operation as a prison camp, more than 500 men died every single day. On certain days, the count climbed towards 600. No antibiotics existed. No quinine was available for malaria sufferers, even as the disease infected nearly every prisoner within weeks. The camp's hospital, such as it was, became less a place of healing and more a way station on the path to death. The Japanese authorities seemed indifferent to the dying. Food was distributed at levels far below subsistence, roughly 100 grams of rice per day, occasionally supplemented with low-quality vegetables or rotted horse meat. This ration, which would have been insufficient for a healthy sedentary adult, was given to men whose bodies had been destroyed by months of siege starvation and 6 days of the march itself. The caloric deficit was not subtle or debatable. Men's bodies were burning the last reserves of muscle and fat simply to remain conscious. Their immune systems, stripped of nutrients, could mount no defense against disease. The Japanese camp administration made no apparent effort to increase the food supply or arrange for proper sanitation. When American officers pleaded with Japanese guards and commanders to allow improvements to latrine systems or water access, they were met with responses ranging from indifference to outright refusal. In some instances, requests were punished. The message became clear to the prisoners and to the few American officers attempting to maintain discipline and care. The Japanese command did not intend for most of these men to survive. Death became the defining feature of life at Camp O'Donnell. In early May, the mortality rate remained so high that burial details were overwhelmed. Men would die during the night and remain in the barracks with the living until the dead could be carried to mass graves. The graves themselves were often shallow, simple holes dug in the ground near the camp's edge, where dozens of bodies were interred together with minimal ceremony. American and Filipino soldiers took turns on the burial detail, a rotation that meant every man was forced to participate in the disposal of his friends. Some prisoners kept records, scratching names and death dates onto scraps of paper or into memory, desperate to preserve evidence that these men had existed, had died, and deserved to be remembered. Others stopped counting after a time. The emotional cost of tracking the dying, of watching men fade over hours or days, of being unable to help them, this cost had no measure. Survivors later spoke of a kind of dissociation, a psychological collapse that occurred around the third or fourth week of captivity at O'Donnell, when the reality of survival at any cost overcame the ability to maintain moral objection to anything the Japanese demanded. The guards at Camp O'Donnell were not uniformly brutal in the way that some of the march's worst overseers had been. Many were older Japanese soldiers, garrison troops, men who maintained a kind of detached cruelty rather than active sadism. But detached cruelty, when exercised in a context of total control and backed by the authority of a military occupation, proved just as lethal as anything more obviously violent. Beatings continued to occur, though less frequently than during the march itself. Prisoners could be struck for speaking out of turn, for being too slow at work details, for infractions real or imaginary. The randomness of punishment remained a psychological weapon. A man might be struck severely for a minor offense, or pass entirely unnoticed after a serious transgression. This unpredictability prevented any sense of safety or order. The Japanese also instituted a system of group punishment, where failures or infractions by one prisoner could result in punishment for his entire section. This created incentive for prisoners to police each other, to inform on potential troublemakers, to maintain discipline through fear. Some American and Filipino sergeants participated in this system, making impossible choices about when to enforce rules and when to look away. Others resisted, attempting to shield their men from the worst consequences, accepting punishment themselves, rather than allow their soldiers to be brutalized further. Into this environment of death and control, the American and Filipino officers and senior enlisted men attempted to construct systems of survival. Medical officers organized themselves into teams to distribute what few medicines they possessed, making triage decisions about who might benefit from treatment versus who should be left to die without intervention. Chaplains held services, whispered prayers, attempted to maintain some spiritual framework for the dying and the living. Supply officers worked with the Japanese to attempt to augment the food supply, a process that achieved small gains at tremendous cost of dignity. Work details were organized so that the weakest men could be protected from the hardest labor. Makeshift education sessions were held by officers who believed that maintaining the mind was essential to preserving the soul, that teaching men mathematics or history or literature could keep some part of them alive, even as their bodies were being destroyed. These efforts were not enough to prevent the dying. They could not reverse the trajectory of starvation and disease, but they mattered as evidence that humanity persisted, that not every institution and relationship at O'Donnell had been reduced to transaction and brutality. By the end of May, the mortality rate at Camp O'Donnell had begun to decline, not because conditions improved, but because the men most vulnerable to immediate death had already died. The camp had become, through sheer casualty, more sustainable. More than 17,000 prisoners, Filipino and American combined, would die at Camp O'Donnell. This number remains one of the starkest measures of the camp's function as a place designed for mass death. Yet the Japanese military, when questioned after the war, would claim that the camp had been established with humanitarian intent. that the conditions were a regrettable result of unforeseen circumstances and supply shortages, that no order had been given to starve or sicken the prisoners. The documentary record suggests otherwise. The planning documents exist. The quarterly reports show the predictable mortality. The indifference to solutions was consistently demonstrated, and yet the legal responsibility remained contested. Was it the fault of General Maeda, the camp commander, or his superiors? Was it the inevitable result of a vast military operation moving faster than logistics could support, or was it an intended outcome of conquest and domination? The prisoners at O'Donnell understood their situation with clarity. They were not going to be exchanged. They were not going to be freed. Those who survived would endure because of luck, strength, or the grace of those few guards and officers who occasionally displayed mercy. As the weeks turned into months, the surviving prisoners absorbed the reality that captivity would be measured not in days, but in years. Some would remain at O'Donnell. Others would be transferred to camps like Cabanatuan or to other locations as the Japanese military adjusted its prisoner distribution system. But O'Donnell had served its function. It had killed thousands in the space of a few weeks through the simple combination of starvation, disease, and indifference. It had broken what remained of the morale and hope of those who survived it, and it had transformed the Death March from a 6-day ordeal into a months-long campaign of attrition that would continue in camps and hell ships and forced labor details across the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. The road north from Bataan, the boxcars at San Fernando, the gates of Camp O'Donnell, these were not the end of the journey for American and Filipino prisoners. They were merely the transition point from one form of dying to another. The gates of Camp O'Donnell had closed behind them, but survival did not end with arrival. For the men who lived past those first lethal weeks, a harder, stranger challenge began. How to endure, not days or weeks, but months and years, in captivity, with virtually nothing. The camps would become their entire world, and within that world, a hidden architecture of resistance, mercy, and small acts of defiance took shape. Cabanatuan, roughly 80 kilometers north of Manila, became the largest and most enduring of the prison camp systems. It was here, in the dry plains of Nueva Ecija province, that thousands of American and Filipino prisoners would spend as much as 3 years behind barbed wire and bamboo. The camp itself was a sprawl of rough barracks, built from split bamboo and nipa palm, arranged in rows across an open, treeless expanse. Guards patrolled constantly, and the Japanese commandant's office stood at the center like a watchtower over the entire apparatus of captivity. But within this machinery of confinement, the prisoners began to organize themselves in ways their captors barely understood. Formal camps had formal structures, and into those structures, men poured their intellect, their experience, and their desperate hope. The senior American officers, and they mattered far more than any Japanese command, established a chain of leadership that mirrored military hierarchy. The commanding officer of each barracks held authority over the men under his roof. Work details had leaders. Mess tents had supervisors. This structure was not rebellion. It was cooperation with Japanese administrative needs, but it created space for the prisoners themselves to enforce discipline, allocate scarce resources, and protect the weakest among them. The Japanese were content to let the Americans police themselves, as long as order was maintained and no one escaped. This arrangement, seemingly built on the prisoners' compliance, became their salvation. Within that hierarchy, a medical corps emerged. American doctors and Philippine Army medical personnel, working with virtually no medicine and almost no equipment, established a hospital compound. There were no antibiotics. There was no surgery in any real sense. The hospital was a place where the dying came to be kept as comfortable as possible before the end, and where the living came to be sorted. Who could return to work detail, who could not, who might recover, who would not. The doctors kept meticulous records in small notebooks, tracking cases of malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and tropical ulcers that turned hands and feet into blackened, gangrenous masses. They conducted autopsies on the dead to understand the diseases killing them, searching for patterns they might exploit to save the next man. These doctors performed acts of medical archaeology under hopeless conditions, guided by memory and improvisation rather than supplies or instruments. Food remained the obsession that never left. The Japanese ration was fixed at roughly 1,700 calories per man per day, far below what was needed by men doing heavy labor, and the quality deteriorated as the war went on. Rice formed the core, often cooked into a thin gruel that provided bulk without nutrition. Kitchen details fought over every grain, every scrap. Some men were assigned to tend vegetable gardens on the camp's periphery, growing what they could from seed and donated plants. Others worked as cooks, a coveted position that offered access to the kitchen and the possibility of extra portions. This was not theft, it was survival, and every man in the camp understood the equation. The sick received slightly larger portions, and medical orderlies who tended the dying were rewarded with an extra handful of rice. These tiny increments could mean the difference between life and death. But nutrition came from beyond the wire as well. Filipino civilians lived near the camp. Farmers, merchants, people with families of their own to feed. At night, or during the confused moments of work details outside the fence, food began to move through the barrier between the imprisoned and the free. A papaya or a banana passed hand to hand in the darkness. An egg, wrapped in leaves, concealed under a shirt. A small bundle of salt, precious beyond measure. The Japanese issued orders against this traffic, and punishment was severe. Sometimes death for both the prisoner who received and the civilian who gave. Families of Filipinos were executed for smuggling food to the camps. Yet they continued. The movement of that contraband food created an invisible web of connection between the camps and the surrounding countryside, and it kept men alive who would otherwise have starved. Education became another form of resistance. In the barracks at night, after the guards had passed, classes began. American officers taught mathematics, history, and languages. Enlisted men shared the practical knowledge of their trades. A prisoner, who had been an engineer before the war, drew architectural sketches in the dirt. Another, who had studied medicine, conducted lectures on human anatomy, using whatever materials could be assembled. These were not formal schools. They were whispered conversations and careful teaching, designed to preserve the mind during the imprisonment of the body. Some men organized discussion groups to debate philosophy and politics. Others maintained a secret library of books, smuggled or remembered from before capture, shared and reshared among readers who consumed them like medicine. Theater emerged as an unexpected form of salvation. In some camps, especially Cabanatuan, prisoners organized elaborate theatrical productions. Scripts were written from memory, cobbled together from whatever sources prisoners could recall. Costume pieces were fashioned from scraps of cloth and captured Japanese uniforms. Props were improvised from bamboo and wire. The performances took place in the open air, often with Japanese officers in attendance. These were not revolutionary acts. They were calculated permissions sought by prisoners who understood that entertainment served Japanese interests by maintaining order and morale control. But the content mattered more than the Japanese understood. Plays that referenced American home, American values, and the eventual American return spoke to something deeper than mere distraction. A man who performed in a play was not just a prisoner, he was an actor, a creator, a participant in a world that transcended the camp's boundaries. Radio sets existed within the camps, crude but functional devices, built from salvaged parts and hidden in creative ways. These radios were almost certainly against Japanese regulations, yet they operated in several of the larger camps for extended periods. Through them, prisoners heard the progress of the war, news that the Allies were advancing in the Pacific, that American forces were taking back islands, that the day of liberation was coming. The men who built these sets and maintained them in hiding took enormous risks. If discovered, execution was certain, but the information they provided was electricity for hope. In a world where days blended into one another, where time seemed suspended in an endless present of hunger and confinement, word of progress in the larger war restored the future. It meant that this was not forever. It meant that someone was coming. Resistance networks connected to the guerrillas, who operated in the hills around the camps, particularly in the provinces where Japanese control was weakest. Filipino resistance fighters maintained contact with prisoners and with the Filipinos who lived near the camps, creating a supply chain that moved medicine, food, and information in both directions. American prisoners who possessed skill in codes or languages were sometimes involved in this work. Messages were carried out. Intelligence about Japanese movements was gathered and transmitted. The Filipino resistance took terrible risks for this work. When security was tightened, when interrogations intensified, when Japanese patrols increased their sweeps around the camps, the supply lines thinned or closed entirely, but they never vanished completely. The connection between the imprisoned and the fighting resistance was one of the closest held secrets of the captive experience. Punishment happened constantly, though not always with violence. Men were slapped for minor infractions, a bow that was not deep enough, a task completed too slowly, a glance directed the wrong way. Some received beatings for more serious offenses. The violence was often random, driven by a guard's mood or the prisoner's bad fortune. But the community responded by absorbing these punishments collectively. A man who was beaten was cared for by others in his barracks. His work detail would cover for him if he was injured and unable to perform. The group understood that individual survival depended on collective survival, and individual cruelty was met with quiet, organized resistance that never rose to the level of rebellion, but remained constant and effective. The camps created hierarchies of survival that were not always comfortable to examine. Men who held positions of authority, barracks leaders, work detail supervisors, medical orderlies, had better access to food and information. Some used that advantage to help others. Some used it to preserve themselves at others' expense. The tension between these poles created the moral complexity of life in the camps. A man might save another's life by smuggling an extra portion of rice, then stand by as that same man was brutalized by a guard. Heroism and selfishness could exist in the same person, sometimes on the same day. The camps revealed that survival was not a simple matter of virtue or courage. It was a constant negotiation between what the body needed, what the conscience demanded, and what circumstances permitted. As months became years, the calendar of captivity developed its own weight. Men marked time by seasons, the dry season, the rainy season, by the arrival of new groups of prisoners or the removal of the dead, by the slow changes in their own bodies as they adapted to starvation or succumbed to it. Some prisoners maintained journals, writing in tiny script on scraps of paper that had to be hidden constantly for fear of discovery. These records became the evidence that they had existed, that they had witnessed what happened, that they mattered. A man might weight his words carefully, knowing that if captured, the journal could be used against him or others. But he wrote anyway, driven by the need to testify to what was happening, to create a record that might outlast the war and himself. The strongest bonds formed between men who shared the smallest spaces, bunks, work details, mess lines. A man would remember, decades after liberation, the face of the person who had sat next to him at meals, the voice of the barracks mate who had kept him awake through a fever, the hands of the medic who had dressed a tropical ulcer. These relationships were tested constantly by starvation, by disease, by the knowledge that one man's survival might come at the cost of another's death. Yet they held. The camps became communities, strange and desperate communities, but communities nonetheless. Men shared food with those who were dying, shortening their own lives in the process. They told stories to keep each other oriented to reality when despair threatened to overwhelm. They reminded each other of names and places and faces from before, maintaining connection to the world that had existed before barbed wire and bamboo. The reality that sustained most of these efforts was a quiet certainty that the war could not last forever. Rumors circulated constantly, some accurate, some wildly optimistic, about Allied progress. Men calculated, based on fragments of information, when liberation might come. The estimates shifted as the war went on. Late 1942 perhaps, then late 1943, then into 1944. Each passing date that fell short of the prediction was crushing, but not quite devastating, because the underlying truth remained intact. The Americans would return. That knowledge, more than any food or medicine, sustained the will to keep going. The camps were a trial, not a destination. Survival was an act of faith in a future that was not yet visible, but remained possible, held in the mind against all evidence that death was more probable than deliverance. While the Death March ground forward and the first terrible weeks of captivity unfolded at Camp O'Donnell, another drama was reaching its climax across the waters, separating Bataan from the fortress island of Corregidor. General Jonathan Wainwright, who had assumed overall command of the Philippine theater after MacArthur's departure, now found himself presiding over a crumbling empire with nowhere left to retreat. The island fortress, called the Gibraltar of the East, sat in Manila Bay, just 7 kilometers from the Bataan coast, and had long been imagined as an impregnable bastion that could hold out indefinitely while relief forces mobilized in the Pacific. But Corregidor was never meant to withstand an assault from an enemy that held air superiority, controlled the surrounding waters, and could pound it from artillery positions on the mainland with near impunity. As April turned to May in 1942, the bombardment intensified with a ferocity that no concrete tunnel or beach fortification could adequately resist. By the 6th of May, after weeks of relentless attack, Wainwright made the decision that sealed the last act of the Philippine campaign. He ordered the surrender of Corregidor and all remaining forces under his command across the archipelago, a capitulation that brought nearly 5,000 more men into Japanese captivity and left roughly 14,000 American and Filipino soldiers scattered through other Philippine islands, either as prisoners of war, fugitives in the mountains, or guerrilla fighters operating in the shadows. The fall of Corregidor was not sudden, though for those who lived through it, the collapse seemed shockingly swift. The Japanese had begun their assault on the island in late April, and the American garrison was already operating at the razor edge of desperation. Water had become critically scarce, supplies were nearly exhausted, the hospital tunnels were overflowing with wounded and disease-ridden men, and the bombardment was unrelenting. Wainwright received no indication that relief was coming, no assurance that he should hold at any cost, and the casualty lists grew longer each day as Japanese artillery and air raids worked methodically to make the island untenable. The decision to surrender Corregidor was not one made in a vacuum, but rather in full awareness of what it meant for the men who would pass into captivity. Wainwright had seen the reports trickling in from Bataan. He knew that the conditions in the camps were appalling, that disease was rampant, and that the Japanese were not providing adequate food or medical care to their prisoners. Yet he also knew that continued resistance would only mean more deaths on Corregidor itself, and that without any realistic prospect of relief or reinforcement, every day of further fighting was buying nothing but suffering. The weight of this calculation pressed on him as he made the broadcast to his scattered forces in the early days of May, ordering them to lay down their arms and surrender to Japanese forces in their respective areas. Wainwright himself was taken prisoner and would remain captive until the end of the war, his health broken by the experience. A general who had inherited an already lost war and made the agonizing choices that came with managing defeat. The Japanese celebrated the fall of Corregidor as a triumph of their military might, and in the broader context of their early war victories, it was merely one jewel among many in an expanding crown of conquest. By May of 1942, Japan had achieved a string of victories that seemed to validate the most audacious predictions of its war planners. The Philippines had fallen. The Dutch East Indies were secure. Malaya and Singapore were under Japanese control. Burma had been conquered, and the Japanese fleet had ranged across the Pacific, sinking warships, destroying air forces, and establishing a perimeter that stretched thousands of kilometers. The sense of momentum was overwhelming, and in Tokyo, military planners spoke confidently about consolidating these gains and forcing the Allies to accept a negotiated peace that would recognize Japan's dominance in East Asia and the Pacific. The loss of the American and Filipino garrison in the Philippines appeared to observers at the time as merely a tragic but inevitable casualty in Japan's larger strategic triumph. What few could have foreseen was that May of 1942 would mark a subtle turning point, that the victories were about to become more difficult to achieve, and that Japan's early advantages in coordination, initiative, and naval power would gradually give way to the grinding reality of American industrial capacity and willingness to absorb losses and continue fighting. But in the moment, with Corregidor falling and the Philippines entirely under Japanese control, such pessimism would have seemed absurd to those surveying the map of Asia and the Pacific from Japanese headquarters. Yet even as the strategic picture shifted in ways that Japan's leaders could not fully perceive, the immediate human catastrophe of the Death March and the subsequent captivity of the men at Bataan and beyond continued unfolding. The news of what had transpired during the march from Mariveles to San Fernando and the conditions of the camps did not travel quickly or transparently. The Japanese authorities had their own reasons for minimizing reports of the march and its brutality. They were concerned about international humanitarian law, wary of giving ammunition to their enemies, and some officers were already aware that what had occurred was indefensible by any civilized standard. Accordingly, they suppressed accounts, discouraged witnesses from speaking, and attempted to control the narrative around the treatment of prisoners. But suppression of truth is a difficult art in war, and stories found their way out through multiple channels. Filipino guerrillas operating in the mountains and jungles of Luzon picked up fragments of accounts from survivors who had escaped the march or the camps, or from civilians who had witnessed the ordeal along the route from Bataan. Some of these reports reached radio operators who maintained clandestine contact with Australian forces and eventually with American intelligence networks. American prisoners who managed to escape from Camp O'Donnell, Camp Cabanatuan, and other detention facilities carried with them eyewitness accounts of the march and the subsequent imprisonment, and as these men made their way to Australia, or eventually were recovered after liberation, their testimonies accumulated into a body of evidence that could no longer be dismissed or easily explained away. The American government's response to the early reports of the Death March was, paradoxically, to suppress the information rather than to trumpet it. In the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Philippines, and through much of 1942 and 1943, the American military and civilian authorities chose not to release the survivor accounts to the American public. The reasons for this decision were complex and not entirely honorable. There was a genuine concern that widespread knowledge of Japanese brutality might inflame American public opinion to a point where it became difficult to manage the war effort strategically, or might provoke demands for immediate retaliation that would undermine plans for conducting the war in stages. There was also considerable uncertainty about the veracity of the accounts. The early reports were scattered and inconsistent, and there was concern about amplifying stories that might later prove to be exaggerated or second-hand. Beyond these practical concerns, however, there was also an element of calculation. Acknowledging the full scope of what had happened at Bataan implied acknowledging profound failures in military preparation, command judgment, and the failure of the government to protect American soldiers in the Philippines. In the dark months of 1942, when the war was going badly across multiple theaters and public morale was fragile, there may have been a judgment that revealing the full extent of this disaster was politically dangerous. Whatever the precise mix of motives, the result was that the American public, in late 1942 and through much of 1943, had only the vaguest awareness that American soldiers in the Philippines had endured something terrible, but not the specific, documented horror of the Death March itself. The suppression of the truth was not complete, however, and by late 1943, scattered reports were circulating in newspapers and magazines, often framed as rumors or unconfirmed stories. Some American soldiers and observers published accounts of what they had heard or experienced, and while these did not receive the prominence that the information would later command, they did begin to seep into the American consciousness. The turning point came in January of 1944, when the American government finally released an official statement based on the detailed testimonies of 3 American officers who had made harrowing escapes from the Philippines and had reached Australia, bearing first-hand accounts of the Death March. These 3 men had been captured, had been part of the march or its immediate aftermath, had managed to escape from Davao Penal Colony in Mindanao through courage and meticulous planning, and had traveled across the Pacific to deliver their testimony to military authorities. When their accounts were synthesized into an official government statement and released to the press, the impact on American public opinion was instantaneous and profound. The specific details of the march, the number of deaths, the descriptions of the sun and the dust, and the deliberate denial of water and food, the random brutality of guards who beat men for falling out of line or attempting to drink from a stream, all of this emerged into the light of day and shattered any remaining sense that the Philippines campaign had been merely one tactical disappointment among many in a long war. The revelation of the Death March in January 1944 transformed American understanding of the Pacific War in ways that extended far beyond the immediate facts of what had occurred on the road from Mariveles to San Fernando. The march became a symbol of Japanese cruelty, a concrete example of a brutality that seemed to suggest something fundamental and terrible about the enemy that Americans were fighting. In the American imagination, the Death March joined Pearl Harbor as an atrocity that demanded retribution, and it hardened American resolve in the Pacific theater in ways that would have profound implications for the conduct of the war in its final 2 years. The revelation also elevated the story of the Bataan defenders into something more elevated in the American consciousness. They were no longer merely the defeated garrison of a lost campaign, but rather men who had endured an organized attempt at their destruction, and their survival or death in the camps became a measure of American fortitude and character. The publication of the survivor accounts coincided with shifting momentum in the Pacific War, as American forces began their island-hopping campaign northward toward the Japanese homeland, and many observers at the time saw the Death March revelations as vindication that American sacrifice and suffering would eventually be answered with victory and the punishment of those responsible. Yet, even as the news of the Death March galvanized American public opinion and strengthened resolve for the final phase of the war itself was already moving in a direction that the Death March survivors could not yet perceive, from within the prison camps where thousands of them still languished. By the time the public revelation came in January 1944, the men at Camp Cabanatuan and the other prison facilities across the Philippines had already endured more than a year and a half of captivity. Many were dying still, weakened by months of inadequate diet, ravaged by tropical diseases, surviving only through a combination of extraordinary luck, underground support networks, and an almost superhuman will to persist. For these men, the knowledge that the world beyond their wire fences was finally learning the truth of what they had endured brought a psychological lift that should not be underestimated. There were radios smuggled into some camps, and word spread that the story was out, that America knew, that the suffering had been witnessed and recorded and would not be forgotten. At the same time, the men also began to notice subtle shifts in the behavior of some of their Japanese guards and officers. The knowledge that war crimes were being documented and reported seemed to create, in some quarters, a desire to appear less culpable, to minimize further atrocities, to perhaps position oneself for a future reckoning. Of course, this was far from universal, and brutality continued in the camps through 1944 and into 1945. But the knowledge that the world was watching, that the Death March was no longer a secret to be suppressed, that accountability was even remotely possible, subtly shifted the moral landscape of the captivity. The period between the revelation of the Death March in early 1944 and the actual liberation of the camps, more than a year later, represents one of the most psychologically complex portions of the entire ordeal. The prisoners now existed in a state of knowledge that hope was possible, that rescue might eventually come, but no one could know when or in what form that rescue would arrive. The American military was still engaged in brutal fighting through the Central Pacific. The Philippines had not yet been invaded, and liberation remained in the future, a promise that lived alongside the immediate reality of hunger and disease in the camps. News filtered in through various channels of American military progress, of island victories, of the steady movement of the war toward the home islands of Japan. Some prisoners allowed themselves to believe, or at least to hope, that liberation would come before the Japanese authorities, desperate and cornered, would order the execution of their prisoners. Others, worn down by years of captivity, made darker calculations and accepted that death might be their more likely fate. The weight was agonizing, and in many ways, the psychological burden of hope, mixed with fear, was harder to bear than the simple despair of the earlier period, when liberation seemed impossible. But the prisoners endured, because endurance was the only choice available to them, and because the revelation that their suffering was known and remembered by the world gave them a reason to believe that their survival might matter, that their ordeal would not be consigned to oblivion and forgotten. The fall of Corregidor on the 6th of May, 1942, brought the active combat phase of the Philippine campaign to an end, but it was merely a punctuation mark in a longer tragedy that would extend across years of captivity. The Japanese had achieved their military objectives in the archipelago. They had eliminated organized American military resistance, and they had secured a vast territory rich in resources that were essential to their war economy. But in doing so, they had also committed acts that would become central to the historical memory of the Pacific War and to the reckoning that would come with Japan's eventual defeat. The wider collapse of Allied resistance across Southeast Asia in the spring of 1942 seemed at the time to herald a Japanese hegemony that might endure for decades, but the very completeness of the victory contained within it the seeds of eventual catastrophe. The American prisoners taken in the Philippines became, without knowing it, witnesses to a dark chapter in military history that would be examined, documented, and ultimately used as evidence in the first great reckoning between modern nations over the conduct of war. Their survival, or their death, took on a significance that transcended their individual fates and entered the realm of historical judgment. As the news of their suffering finally reached the American public in 1944, it brought with it a kind of somber closure to the initial phase of the Pacific War and an opening toward the long process of reckoning that would extend into the post-war period and beyond. For nearly 2 years, the truth had been locked away. While tens of thousands of prisoners languished in camps across the Philippines and Japan, while survivors carried memories of the march that would never fully leave them, the American government kept its silence. Officially, little was known. The military had issued carefully worded statements about unconfirmed reports. The press, hungry for stories from the Pacific, had almost nothing to report. Families of captured soldiers wrote letters that went unanswered. The American people, fighting now with growing momentum across the Pacific, had no clear picture of what Japanese captors had done to their sons and brothers. This silence was not accidental. It was policy, born from calculation and complexity, maintained through deliberate restriction of information, and it would hold until the early weeks of 1944, when 3 men who had managed the impossible broke through the official fog. The delay had roots in the chaos of the early war itself. In the months immediately following the fall of the Philippines in May of 1942, the American military command was overwhelmed with crisis. Japan controlled vast stretches of the Pacific. The defense of Australia seemed in question. Resources were desperately stretched. In this atmosphere of emergency, the fate of prisoners captured in the Philippines was not the foremost concern. Intelligence officers gradually collected fragments of information through guerrilla networks operating in the Philippines, through escaped prisoners who made their way to Australia or China, through intercepted Japanese communications. A picture emerged, piece by piece, of terrible conditions in the camps, of starvation, of disease, of brutality. But these reports remained scattered, unverified in the formal sense, compartmentalized among different military branches and intelligence agencies. No comprehensive account existed. No official narrative had been assembled. Without such documentation, military leaders reasoned, public disclosure would be premature. It might provoke retaliation against prisoners still held by Japan. It might raise questions that the military command preferred not to answer, about the decision to fight and hold in the Philippines, about the retreat, about whether more could have been done to prepare for captivity or to mount rescue operations. There was also a deeper political consideration. The American government was fighting a two-front war, and in the European theater, the alliance with the Soviet Union, however strained, was deemed essential. The Pacific War, by contrast, was increasingly an American show. Public opinion needed to be managed carefully. Stories of atrocities committed by the Japanese might harden American resolve, which seemed desirable, but they might also raise awkward questions about Allied strategy, about priorities in resource allocation between Europe and the Pacific, about why the government had allowed such a catastrophe to unfold. And there was the matter of China. American political leaders hoped to preserve the nationalist Chinese government as a counterweight to both Japan and Soviet influence after the war. Inflammatory stories about Japanese brutality, while certainly true, might provoke escalations that complicated the delicate diplomatic balance. For all these reasons, officially, the story of the Death March and the camps remained suppressed. The American press, operating under wartime censorship, had little to work with. What rumors circulated were dismissed as unconfirmed. The matter was filed away, waiting. But waiting was not possible forever. Among the thousands of prisoners held in the Philippines was a small group of American officers who would refuse to be forgotten. 3 men in particular determined that the truth would emerge. In late 1943, using a route that involved tremendous risk and relied on the aid of Filipino guerrillas, these 3 officers succeeded where so many others had failed. They escaped from Davao Penal Colony, a prison camp in the southern Philippines, where American and Filipino prisoners were being forced to work in mines and plantation labor under conditions barely better than those of the camps further north. The escape itself was an act of extraordinary courage and cunning. The journey from the southern Philippines to Australia, undertaken in small boats and through Japanese-controlled waters, demanded luck that many escaped prisoners never found. But these 3 men reached Melbourne in late 1943, carrying something invaluable: first-hand testimony. They had lived through the march. They had seen men die around them. They had survived the camps, and they had decided that if they could escape, they would speak. Military intelligence officers in Australia immediately recognized the significance of what these men could tell. The 3 officers were debriefed extensively, their accounts cross-checked against each other and against the fragmentary intelligence that had previously been collected. What emerged was a comprehensive narrative of the march from beginning to end, the first authoritative account from American officers who had been present throughout. The military command, reviewing this testimony, faced a decision point. The information was now too solid, too detailed, too corroborated to remain suppressed. Continuing to withhold it would become increasingly difficult. Word had begun to spread through military channels. Rumors were circulating, and the escaped officers themselves could not be indefinitely silenced. By early 1944, the decision was made at high levels of the American government. The full accounts would be released to the public. The date was set for the first week of January. The release would be carefully coordinated through official military channels, presented with statements that emphasized the government's commitment to justice and accountability, framed in ways that would strengthen American resolve without appearing to question the competence of American military leadership or the soundness of earlier decisions. On the 2nd of January, 1944, the American government released the accounts of the 3 escaped officers to the press and the American public. The story was spread across the front pages of newspapers throughout the country in the days that followed. The accounts were brutally direct. They described the assembled prisoners at Mariveles, weakened by months of siege, given no food and almost no water, before being forced to march northward. They described the heat, the disease, the casual brutality of guards who killed men for attempting to drink from streams or falling behind the column. They described Camp O'Donnell, where thousands more died of disease and starvation in the weeks after the march had ended. The specific numbers were staggering. The accounts made clear that somewhere in the range of 10,000 prisoners, perhaps more, had died during and immediately after the march, and in the first weeks of captivity. The American public, reading these accounts in newspapers and hearing them summarized on the radio, responded with shock and outrage that had been carefully suppressed for nearly 2 years. The revelation struck with particular force because it could no longer be dismissed as rumor or speculation. These were accounts given by American officers, men whose names were attached to their testimony, men whose military rank gave their words authority. The government released photographs of the survivors, images that showed the physical devastation wrought by captivity. American families, who had been uncertain about the fate of their relatives, now had terrible clarity. The government announced that General Homma, the Japanese commander of the Philippines campaign, and General Masaharu Kawane, another senior Japanese officer implicated in the march, would face investigation for war crimes. Justice would be pursued. The implicit message was that American military leadership was on the side of its soldiers, seeking accountability against an enemy that had committed atrocities. But the release of the truth also unleashed questions and anger that could not be so easily managed. Veterans organizations demanded to know why the government had kept the information secret for so long. If American soldiers were being murdered by their captors, why had the public not been told? Why had rescue operations not been mounted? Why had the government waited nearly 2 years before revealing the facts? The answers, which involved military strategy, political calculation, and the brutal logistics of Pacific warfare, were far more complex than the public anger could easily accommodate. Some families of the dead demanded that the government explain how such a catastrophe had been allowed to occur. Military leaders, particularly General MacArthur, faced pressure to respond to implications that the collapse in the Philippines and the subsequent treatment of prisoners reflected failures of command. MacArthur, now engaged in his promised return to the Philippines, presented the Liberation Campaign as the vindication of American honor and a prelude to justice against those responsible for the atrocities. The revelation transformed the American understanding of the Pacific War in fundamental ways. Previously, the war against Japan had been framed primarily in strategic and political terms. Japan was an enemy that had attacked American territory, that threatened American interests in the Pacific, that had to be defeated militarily. The Pacific War was understood as a competition of industrial capacity and military ingenuity. With the public release of the Death March accounts, the emotional and moral dimensions became impossible to avoid. The Japanese were now seen, for millions of Americans, as barbaric and cruel, as a people capable of systematic cruelty toward helpless prisoners. The war took on some of the moral clarity that the war against Nazi Germany had long possessed in American consciousness. It was not merely a strategic conflict, it was a war against evil. This transformation in public perception had profound consequences for how Americans would conduct the remainder of the Pacific War, and how they would treat Japan after the war's conclusion. The stories of the Death March, repeated and reinforced through the remaining 18 months of warfare, became part of the justification for ever more total war, for campaigns of island hopping that showed Japanese defenders no mercy, for firebombing campaigns against Japanese cities that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. American military leaders and political authorities could point to the Death March when questioned about the intensity and brutality of American operations in the Pacific. The enemy had shown no mercy to American prisoners. Why should America extend mercy to the enemy? The moral clarity that the revelation provided also reinforced American commitment to seeing the war through to unconditional surrender. There would be no negotiated peace. There would be no mercy for Japan. The war would continue until Japan was utterly defeated. By January of 1944, the prisoners still alive in the camps, still enduring their captivity, remained unaware that their agony had finally been given voice in the country they had fought to defend. The march had occurred in April of 1942. Nearly 2 years had passed. Most of the men who had died had already been dead for months or years. The survivors had endured 30 months of captivity, with no hope of relief, no knowledge that anyone outside the camps was bearing witness to their suffering. The revelation of the truth in America did not rescue them. It did not bring them food or medicine. It did not shorten their captivity by a single day. But it did, in a sense, restore to them a kind of dignity. They were no longer forgotten. They were no longer a matter of military secrecy. The American people now knew what had happened to them. The question of accountability had been opened. Justice, whatever form it might ultimately take, had been put on the agenda. The truth, delayed though it was, had broken the surface, and the American people's understanding of their enemy and of what their sons and brothers had suffered was forever altered. By late 1944, the Japanese Empire had begun its long retreat across the Pacific. American forces, island hopping from the Central Pacific and driving up through New Guinea, were closing in on the Philippines from 2 directions. The men imprisoned in camps, scattered across Luzon and Mindanao, could not have known it with certainty. But deliverance was coming. After nearly 3 years of captivity, starvation, and disease, the liberation of the Philippines would begin, and with it would come the desperate race to free thousands of prisoners before their captors could destroy the camps and the men still alive in them. The American return to the Philippines began in late October of 1944, when General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte Gulf, fulfilling the pledge he had made 2.5 years earlier when forced to abandon his men. The islands became a crucible of combat once again, with Japanese forces fighting with the same suicidal determination that had characterized their resistance elsewhere. American commanders fighting northward toward